like to welcome you all to the first workshop seminar of the Metamaps program. This is something that Roberto and I started designing about a year ago. And we're going to be doing this for about 2 years. And I want to extend a special thanks to Lam Miu Ling for being our in-person speaker here. We have some fantastic speakers coming in from overseas. And next week we're having a second event with many more speakers here in Hong Kong. And we're planning to build this out over a 2-year period that will end up in practical workshops, performances, and all sorts of things. So we wanted to begin this just with a really short introduction of what we're doing and why we're doing it. We're going to give a presentation today with a little bit of background on our own collaboration that's been going on and off for about 7 years. Roberto's a musician, I'm a visual artist. We both work in creative technology, and we've been looking for about 7 years for different ways to exchange elements of our practice through various technological and sort of creative pipelines. And that metaphorically is basically what we wanted to build this workshop series about, is the ways that different artists can collaborate through technological bridges across different creative domains, be they music, visual domains, movement, text, and so on. And so what we've done to start with is we've looked for artists that we know or that we really look up to, and we've invited them today to be our first speakers. And the purpose of this is to, I suppose, set the tone for what we want to build over the next couple of years, and to start to build a bit of a library of knowledge and experience and ideas and approaches. Roberto.
Yeah, so the idea of mapping that we're trying to work with is quite broad. You're thinking of mapping as a process of translation that is aesthetically charged. And so that can be applied to almost anything. You can be mapping different types of data. You can be mapping in between different modalities of the same thing, or artistic domains, thinking of sound to image, sound to movement, we've used different sensors, different approaches. So the idea is quite broad, but we think it's quite interesting. In principle, you may think that it only applies to kind of digital arts, but we don't think that's the case. I think there's a lot of artists out there doing research and developing contents that are maybe not digital, but still relevant and significant for the idea of mapping on this kind of broad perspective. As we develop these workshops until the end of the year, we will develop new technological solutions, hopefully, new ideas, and then in December there is a performance. We'll invite everyone that is going to have a free space where all of this is going to be combined and put together into a 1-hour-long performance integrating different elements. So today we have a selection of international and local artists and scholars, I think coming from different perspectives. From younger generation to someone like Jon, who's joining now, who has been working in this domain for the past 30 years, and he's going to share some of his experiences, and then we'll present, as Bill was pointing out as well, our research and what we've done so far, so that you know where we're coming from.
Yeah. So without further ado, we'd like to invite our first speaker.
Yeah,
and also, would you like to jump this? And I'll just check a couple of techniques. Are we recording this? Fabulous. Okay. Yeah, let's introduce Jon.
Jon, yeah.
So, Jon will just.
Hi, Jon.
Hey, can you hear me? Can you hear me?
We can. Let me.
Yeah, I'll just bring Jon over.
Hi, Jon. Can you hear us?
Yes, not very well, but when you put the microphone close, I can hear you, so...
Okay. Let's try now. Is that any better?
That's much better.
Okay, sorry.
Yeah.
Yes. Well, thank you for being here. It's an honor and a pleasure to have you here. As I guess most people know here, Jon is based in Australia. He's a professor at Monash University, director at Sensi Lab, a prominent artist that has been exhibited everywhere with many, many international awards, and a really interesting scholar and a really nice person as well, I can tell you. So it's a true honor to have you here, to open this first event. And yeah, thank you. If you want, we can just proceed. If you have any questions, or if we get any questions from the audience, we'll write them down, and then at the end we can have a quick Q&A.
Great, thank you, Roberto, and it's a pleasure to be virtually here. I'll just get straight into it, and as Roberto said, if anyone has any questions or anything like that, please ask, because it's a bit weird just me talking into a screen. So let me just share my screen, and hopefully everything should be okay. Yep. Right. Can everyone see this?
Yes.
Yep. Great. Okay. So yeah, I'll get straight into what I wanted to talk about, which was really just to cover a couple of projects that I think might be relevant, that sort of talk about the concept of multimodal mapping, but maybe in a different way. And I thought I'd start just by talking about the traditional way that people have conceptualized, particularly when you work with computers, interaction. And that's the mode that I call computer as tool. So this is from a paper I wrote quite a long time ago, when we were thinking about other ways to use computers apart from them just being tools. But this is a dominant paradigm, and it's still very dominant today. And it's not that it's a bad paradigm or a wrong paradigm. It's just that there are other possibilities. But I think to introduce the other possibilities, you first have to understand this paradigm. And that's the idea where you have a person who's often, in the human-computer interaction literature is referred to as a user, and that they have some intention. That intention is analyzed by the computer and then interpreted, and that is used to create something, which is the output that the computer produces. And this might be working continuously. So it might be the generation of sound, it might be the generation of imagery, or it might be something else. But there's this very definite flow between intention and output. And I guess you would think of that as a mapping, that interpretation. So once the information goes into the computer, there's a mapping between that user input and the output that's produced. So I'm just going to show you a project. This is not my project, but it's a project in our lab that I'm involved with. It's led by a percussionist and researcher, Alonso. It's called the Estics. And this is a prototype of one of the prototypes of the devices that we've been developing in our lab. And it's using this mapping. And mapping is really, really interesting to the researchers here, because this device basically, it just measures gesture. It measures the acceleration, the orientation of the device in real time, and it transmits that over Bluetooth very quickly. And it's used for music creation. And as researchers, we're really interested in the traditional mappings, like how do we map a person's gestural movement to something that's musically meaningful. So I'll just play a quick video of Alon using this so you get a sense of how this device works and what it can do. So I think you get the idea there that there's an obvious mapping between the gestural motion and the sound that the device uses to output. And a lot of that is to do with energy. So the amount of energy that you put into the movement is a parameter that's mapped directly to the output. So it's using this very, as I said, traditional paradigm of computer as tool that's shown on the left here. But for many years, I've been really interested in a different kind of way of thinking about computers, and that's more akin to the biological concept of an ecosystem. And I'm not talking about biology as being the point of the simulation or anything like that. It's just purely metaphorical. So thinking about the computer as part of an ecosystem that includes the environment and the noise and other aspects that are in the physical environment itself. So we don't think of the person so much as a user anymore, but as a participant and a player or an organism, if you like, that's in that environment. So that's really what I'm going to talk about for the next couple of minutes, and just show you a couple of different works that use this method or this kind of way of thinking about how we do interaction and how we do mapping in a way that's different than the tool environment. And the reason why I want to work this way is because I'm really interested in this concept of generative systems. So I won't go into a lot of detail about what they are. Maybe many of you have probably heard of them, but they have a series of properties, and I'll explain what these are in a minute. But just to summarize them, they generate complexity from what's known as bottom up. So rather than trying to make something complex from the beginning, you start with something simple, and that simple thing builds its own complexity. So in a sense, you're getting something for nothing. You're getting complexity for free. It's a systemic approach. So in an ontological sense, it prioritizes process over object. It exploits properties that are sort of ubiquitous in the universe, I guess, such as emergence, which is the generation of higher order properties from simpler primitives. And generally those higher order properties are more complex. And another principle of generative systems is this idea of database amplification, which I'll go into a little bit of detail in a second. And lastly, I think they're a really interesting perspective for what I would call creative discovery, so that people working in combination with these systems are able to discover new forms of creativity and creative behavior that they couldn't have done without them. So let me just quickly explain what I mean by database amplification, because this is kind of at the heart of a lot of what I'll be talking about. And some of the other principles will become apparent when I show you a couple of works in a minute. But the basic idea of database amplification is that you have a very simple specification of low complexity. So this could be something like a set of rules, a set of principles, a set of parameters. And through this generative process, and this doesn't have to be computational, it can be biological, it can be mechanical, it can be anything basically. But by using this specification of low complexity, the generative process uses a processual way of understanding that specification to generate a form, an artifact, or a behavior that has much higher orders of complexity. And if we're talking about computers, this complexity can be orders of magnitude, so tens, hundreds, thousands, millions, even billions of times more complex than the original specification. And if you're wondering what a common example of this is, it's us, it's DNA. So if you think about the way that all life on Earth comes to be generated, if you want to think of it in that way, it's from a specification that's encoded in the amino acids that make up our DNA. And that, if you think about that as a series of codes, if you like, so biologists use the letters A, T, G, C, and those base pairs basically encode through a whole complex series of molecular machinery the ability to build complex things like people, for example. So the first work I'm going to show you that uses these principles is called niche constructions, and I've been working on this for quite a few years on and off, but the basic idea is more than a decade old. I'll cut to the chase and just tell you what it is and how it works. It's a population of line drawing agents. Whoops, sorry, gone past too fast. It's a population of line drawing agents, and basically what they are software agents, if you like, software drawers, and all they do is draw on a canvas. They can just either deposit ink or not deposit ink. And they have 5 parameters that control all of their behavior. So they're listed here. I'll go through them quickly and then I'll show you what they do. So curvature is just how much they want to change their direction. There's a value called irrationality, which is the propensity to sort of wander from the fixed path that they're currently on. There's fecundity, which is their probability that they will give birth to children, which also draw lines. Mortality, which is the probability of dying, which means they'll stop drawing. And lastly, offset, which is where, when they have children, they'll place those children in relation to where they currently are on the canvas. And the canvas is just a flat 2D surface. There's only one rule in this system, and that's if an agent crosses another line. So if you're drawing and you happen to intersect with another line, you die. That's the end. And this is the entire system. So you can see the specification is very simple. It just consists of 5 parameters and a single rule. So to give you a sense of what these parameters do, this is probably the most interesting one. It's the irrationality gene. So all of the parameters just vary between 0 and 1, and a value of 0 means that the agent will just draw a straight line. As you increase the value of the irrationality, the line gets more kind of crazy and irrational. So you can see on the right there, when it's 1, it's just sort of moving around in very tight circles. Okay, so if you run this, you seed your blank canvas with a few of these agents and you just let them run, you get these drawings that are reasonably complex. And the genes themselves, the parameters, are just determined randomly at the beginning. And by randomly changing them, of course, you get drawings of different qualities and with different characteristics. But one thing that you do notice is that even though there's some complexity here, the complexity seems to be fairly uniform across the entire drawing. There's not a lot of change in density, for instance. In the drawing on the left, the agents were started in a random position, and the drawing on the right, they all started from the center and were facing outwards. So you can kind of see that dark bit in the center where they began. So what I wanted to do with this system was map the complexity in a different way than just the basic system's vocabulary had the capability of doing. And so in order to do that, I turned to this process, which is called niche construction, and it's a biological process. It's commonly observed in a lot of organisms on Earth, including humans. So it's widely discussed amongst biologists that human language is a product of niche construction. I'm not going to turn this into a biology lesson. If you're interested in this, you can Google it and you can find out all about it. A lot's been written about it. But basically, some examples are termites that build these nests that basically keep the internal temperature of their nest at a very constant temperature despite changes in the environment. Beavers, which build dams and so on. So the niche construction process is just simply creating an environment for a particular organism that is likely to result in the organism's offspring having a higher chance of survival. So organisms modify their environmental niches, creating or maintaining a heritable environment for their offspring. So we can apply that to this very simple line drawing system. And the way that we do that is just add one more parameter, an additional gene, which is a preference for a particular density. And then as the system is running, and you can see this in this diagram here, in a square area around where the agent is, we just measure the density and we map that measured density to the preference that the agent has. And that follows a sort of a bell curve. So if you're in the sweet spot, if the density is exactly what you want, you're going to be very happy. If the density is too dense or not dense enough, you're going to be unhappy. And eventually, if it gets too far off what you want, you're going to die because of that. And this very simple addition creates an incredible amount of variation and complexity. So in this video, it's just running in real time from the system. You can see it's very simple. there's a series of agents, and some of them have a higher density preference than others. So they end up basically drawing, the ones that have high density end up drawing lots of thick lines very close together. The ones that don't like the high density, but prefer a lower density, tend to carve off areas and have fewer offspring and create these areas of white space in order to preserve that preference for less density. So you can see that from this process, you get this much greater variation in the complexity of the drawings, and to my mind, they're much more interesting. They feel like they've got some kind of weird intention. And remember, this is just starting off from a blank canvas. There's nothing else apart from those 6 variables and that one rule that if you intersect with another line, you stop drawing, that creates these drawings of incredible complexity. So again, it's an example of this principle of database amplification, where we've got a very simple set of rules generating a huge amount of complexity. And just by changing the starting position of the agents and the number of agents, you get all this variation in the kinds of drawings that are possible. So it really feels like it's a huge parameter space of possibilities, and just through that simple mapping, being able to get a lot of complexity. And just to sort of tail end this part of the talk, we took the algorithm and put it into a real robot rather than a software simulation of a robot, and got it to draw. And you get, kind of similar behavior. These are very large-scale drawings that were done for the ICHCAI conference. It's an artificial intelligence conference in 2015. So a couple of robots just sitting around measuring the density of the lines drawn underneath them and trying to alter the density based on preference. Okay, I'm going to take a little side diversion just momentarily to talk about feedback loops, because I think these are really interesting and part of this whole ecosystemic process. So just to talk about what I mean by feedback loops very quickly, again, I'm talking in a very general conceptual sense. You have some kind of process that has inputs going into the process and outputs coming out of that process. In the standard concept of feedback, you just take the outputs and put them into the inputs. So the classic example is if you have a microphone and a speaker, and you put the microphone close enough to the speaker, the sound from the speaker gets picked up by the microphone, and that gets fed back into the microphone, that goes back into the speaker, and so on, and you just get annoying feedback. If you make one simple change to that system and add some kind of variable function that transforms the output before feeding it back into the input, that can give rise to an incredible amount of complexity and change. So this one simple addition can result in a whole series of different ways of thinking about what feedback is capable of doing. Now, anyone who's old enough to remember Doctor Who, which maybe is nobody, will remember this. I'm just going to play this video really quickly. All they did was point the video camera at a screen, and pointing the video camera at the screen created all this complexity. And you can still do this today. Particularly it works well with analog video cameras. And of course, the whole series of artists who worked with video feedback going back from the 1950s, 1960s. And another classic example is iterated function systems, fractal systems, that basically just mathematical systems that feed back on themselves and generate this huge amount of complexity. Another great example from the 1940s is Ross Ashby's homeostat. This was an electromechanical device that basically had 4 units that were filled with magnetic fluid and fed back on themselves, and basically tried to maintain what was called homeostasis. So basically there's perturbations put into the system, and the system feeds back on itself and tries to maintain a stable state. And Ashby believed this was the basis for how to build thinking analog machines. And indeed, it's been used by musicians, by computer scientists. It's a really interesting area. If you're interested, just Google, homeostat, and you'll find a whole lot of information about it. Another example of this feedback is in the book by Douglas Hofstadter that he wrote quite a while ago now, I Am a Strange Loop. And his his long convoluted argument that consciousness was this constant feedback process as well. Brattenberg wrote this book in the 1980s called Experiments in Synthetic Psychology that used this very simple feedback process in early robotics to give them intelligence as well. With just 2 neurons, the robot was able to avoid obstacles and navigate through an environment. The really famous work by Alvin Lucia, I Am Sitting in a Room, for those of you who don't know this work, is basically he put himself in a room with a microphone and recited a short text on and recorded it onto tape, and then got the tape and played it back into the room, recorded it again, played it back into the room, recorded it again, played it back. Let's have a quick listen to the first, and I'll fast forward this video because it runs for 20 minutes.
I am sitting in a room different from the one you are in now. I am recording the sound of my speaking voice, and I am going to play it back into the room again and again.
A way to smooth out any irregularities my speech might have.
So you can see that after, many times, repeating this many times, the voice itself completely disappears and the resonances of the room become really prominent, and you get this whole sort of musical resonant performance emerging through this very simple feedback process. The last thing I want to show in this is this great device. I don't know if anyone's used it before, called Cosmos Drifting Memory Stations, designed by Vlad Kramer from Soma Labs. It's using this feedback principle, and it has, it's like basically an echo unit. It's for sound, for music, but it uses prime numbers rather than using metrical beat rhythms to do the feedback. And it's an amazing device to play with in terms of getting these really interesting feedback, using feedback systems in this way. Okay. Next, I wanted to talk about this work, Eden, which is quite old, but I think it's really relevant in terms of this idea of combining mapping and feedback together. It was inspired by some time I spent in a national park in the northern part of Australia. It's called Lidgefield National Park. So it's at the very top end of Australia. Just it's actually quite close to Indonesia in terms of the Australian mainland, and it's very remote, but extremely beautiful. These are just shots from a tourist brochure, but it has a whole lot of waterfalls and lagoons, but also it has these incredible termite mounts. And termites are a really interesting example of a simple organism that through emergent complexity can build structures that are very complex. So they maintain a homeostatic environment in terms of temperature, even though it gets very hot, 30 or 40 degrees in the summer, and at night it gets very cold. Inside the nest, the temperature is constant all the time. The size of the structure is thousands of times bigger than an individual termite, and yet collectively they're able to do this. And interestingly, they're able to do this without an architect, a central planner, a boss ant who's kind of organizing all the ants and telling them what to do. They just self-organize and are able to create these incredibly complex structures. So this was the inspiration for this work, which is basically a simulation of an ecosystem in 2D. And so in early 2000, I came back from this national park really excited because I'd spent 4 or 5 days there just camping and looking and watching and observing the nature around me. And it really inspired me to try and create a simulation of this. And I guess in a way you could think of this as a very contemporary version of a landscape painting, but rather than painting the landscape literally or even figuratively, I was painting with process rather than painting with paints or trying to visually replicate what I'd observed. I was trying to replicate what I'd observed in terms of processes. So the way that this system works is very simple. There are 3 kinds of entities in the world. There are agents which are capable of learning and reproducing and making sound. There's what's called biomass, which you can think of as just like plants. And there are rocks, which are hard and which, if you bump into them, they'll hurt you. You can't penetrate them. But you could also use them for shelter. And you can also use them for protection. So the world basically runs as a simulation, and the simulation works in real time. It takes about 15 minutes of real time on Earth for a year of simulation time to pass in this Eden world. And in the original version of the work, I just wrote it as a simulation that ran on the computer to see if I could get complex behavior emerging in this ecosystem in a similar way to what I'd observed in the national park. I just wanted to spend one slide just talking very briefly about how the creatures, the agents, if you like, organisms, whatever you want to call them, work. They have a series of sensors, and they can sense the color of the cells around them. If there's nutritional value, they can hear sound at different frequencies that's close by. They can smell, they can introspect pain. So if another agent is hitting them, or if they've bumped into a rock, that pain sensor will basically light up. And they can also introspect energy. So basically, energy is a measure of how healthy they are. If they don't have enough energy, they'll die. If they eat food, they'll get some energy. If they run around without eating food for too long, the energy will start to drop, and again, they'll die. Inside the agent, I guess conceptually, is a mapping. It's a really complicated mapping, and this mapping is dynamic, and it's learnt by the agent as it's interacting with the world around it. It uses a technique called extended classifier systems, which is a kind of machine learning system, a little bit different than neural networks, but still very capable of learning and adapting to environments. And through this learning system, it can decide what it wants to do. So the possibilities are quite simple. It can move forward, it can turn left or turn right. And of course, turning left constantly means just turning around in a circle. It can hit whatever's in front of it. It can mate with whatever's in front of it. It can try and eat with whatever's in front of it, or it can sing, which means make a sound at a particular frequency. Now, of course, choosing these actions can either be positive or negative, depending on what's in front of you. So if you try and eat some food that's in front of you, that's probably going to increase your energy. And the action or the set of rules or set of events that led to you doing that will result in positive reinforcement from the environment. So that rule will tend to get used more often. If you try and move forward into a rock, that's going to hurt you. So your pain sensor will rise and your energy will drop. And so the environment has given you negative feedback. So the rules that said to do that will diminish in terms of their likelihood to be used. So what happens is, over a long period of time, the agents learn how to exist in the world, and they learn how to find food, they learn how to mate with each other, they learn how to use sound in order to signal if a predator's coming, for example, or to call their offspring. And so these learned behaviors aren't programmed into the system, they're learnt by the system as it runs. So this eventually became an artwork, an installation work that was shown all around the world. And I've got this sort of schematic diagram here showing how it's presented before I'll actually show you the work in situ. So there were two screens that project the virtual world into the real world, and those screens are transparent. And this was done deliberately to try and blur the boundaries between this virtual space where these agents exist and the real space in which people are moving and interacting. And in order to hear what they're doing, there's 4 speakers around the screens, which basically spatialize the sound coming from each of the agents. So people in the space can hear what the agents are, the sounds that they're making. And the last important point is there's an infrared camera, which is mounted on the top, and that's just a machine vision system that can detect people, and that information is fed back to the computer. So It recognizes when a person is standing near the screen, and it tracks that person and looks at how long they're there and whereabouts within the installation space they are. And the last thing is there's a fog machine, which kind of makes it kind of misty and mysterious, but it also helps to blur the projection and make it seem three-dimensional, so that, again, the differentiation between the real environment and the virtual environment is diminished. So this is what it looks like with a person standing there. The environment itself is very abstract, but it's constantly changing and dynamic. It's just using this very simple visual representation of the agents, the food, and the rocks. And they're all based on this lattice grid that gets projected into the environment. So the important thing that I wanted to talk about with this work is the mappings. And these two mappings are really what makes the work, I guess. So the mappings are very simple. Basically, the presence of someone is mapped to the production of food. So the longer that you stay in the installation, the more likely food is to appear near where you are standing. And the reason for using this mapping was because of interest. If you visit an art museum and you go and see an artwork, the more interesting the work is, the longer you're likely to stay and look at the work. If the work is uninteresting, you're likely to leave because it's just not interesting. And this simple principle is used as basically a proxy for interest. So the virtual creatures in the environment have no direct knowledge of whether a human is present or not. But what they do know is that sometimes food is more plentiful than others. And over time, they learn that by making interesting sounds, they can keep people in the space for longer, hence increase their production of food. And so that allows them to live for longer and to survive and reproduce. The second mapping is that people's movement maps to the mutation rates. So these creatures are breeding and living and dying over short periods of time. And so the more that people move around, the more restless they are. So the more that they're sort of looking for something interesting. So that promotes change in the creature's behavior. So basically the mutation rates, their learning mutation rates, increase if people are moving around. If they're still, you're probably sitting, listening and enjoying what's happening. So you don't want the sound or the behavior to change too much. Whereas if you're moving around to find something new, you want the behavior to change. So these two simple mappings led to a whole series of really interesting outcomes in terms of how the work works. I've got a video here. I'll play it in a second, but I'll just describe very briefly what's happening. So this was shot in a gallery in Melbourne, and it was a very busy day. So a lot of people have been in. So you can see that there's a lot of food. And so all the creatures are kind of content because there's lots of food there. But everyone is outside the sensing area of the camera, and except for a little boy who starts running around. So the food starts to run out, and you'll hear the creatures making all these sounds, basically trying to call people back into the installation space. And the little boy runs around. Eventually he gets his dad to come in too. So I'll just play the video, and all the sounds that you're hearing are generated in real time by the creatures. And these are sounds, or the sequence of sounds is what they've learnt to make after 2 weeks of this being in the gallery, and being able to kind of basically learn that by making these interesting sounds, people are likely to stay for longer. So I guess just to talk very briefly, and then I'll finish, about what's interesting about this is that none of those behaviors were programmed into the system. The system itself learnt those behaviors. So in my earlier slide, I mentioned creative discovery. That's an example of creative discovery, that the behavior of the system was not something explicitly programmed into it. It was behavior that emerged through the synergetic interaction between humans and virtual creatures, between human and machine. And that's why I think these systems are so interesting and so exciting, because they can provide you with something that's beyond your capability as an artist or designer to actually conceptualize directly or to program directly. So that's it for my talk. I'm really happy to answer questions. If you're after more information, I have a website that's got lots of other examples of works that I've done, including the works that I've talked about. And I'd be really happy to answer any questions. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Jon. That was really interesting, really amazing. Do we have any questions from the audience? Anyone? Be brave. No? Come on.
Nobody ever wants to be the first person with the question.
Do you want to be the first person?
Kind of.
Okay, go.
Jon, can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Great.
Very clear.
Thank you so much for the talk. I really, really loved it. One small question, and it's like an opinion-based question rather than, to me, a factual question, but I was thinking about that last artwork you showed, that the interaction in a way seemed to be recording the audience rather than a feedback mechanism that the audience might have been directly aware of. You know, the kid running past probably didn't know exactly what the feedback mechanism was, and us watching the kid, we're aware, and so we're sort of watching this system record the participants, which is a little bit different to being the participants ourselves. If you compare that to something like the first part of a computer game, where there's always that stage where it's teaching you the mappings, you know, there'll be a few levels where it's really telling you about what the system is, maybe also what the fictional layer is, who your character is, but really what all the buttons do. And there's that, it's kind of necessary. You know, if you jump in at level 5, it'll be a disaster. I was interested from your experience and your sort of artistic instincts here, what do you feel is the difference between a system where the audience might not really know what the mapping is, and one where the mapping is very explicit that the audience needs to understand it? Are they different types of works for you? Is it just a different kind of creative move, or do you have any way to kind of talk to this difference?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. The mechanism for interaction for this actually came out of the time that it was made, when interactivity was a big thing in media arts 20 years ago, 30 years ago, because it was new. And but most of it was the mappings were very simple, if you like. So, you know, in the example you used, the ability to learn something was pretty straightforward, or if it wasn't straightforward in an artwork environment where people are coming in and pretty much instantly need to understand the language of interaction, you're just confused, or you just think, "What? I don't understand what's going on here." So with this work, it wasn't so much designed to be interactive in that sense, about like a stimulus and a response. It was designed to be reactive to you. So there's no wrong way to behave. There's no wrong kind of interaction that you can do. It's a synergetic environment between an artificial world and the world that you're in. And so many people read up about it before and knew exactly what everything meant and said, look, if I stand still, look, you can see the foods. Look, you know, they were very didactic about the whole thing. Other people just kind of soaked up the experience. And I remember there was one person who came in every day for the entire month that the exhibition was on at lunchtime. And I spoke to him at the end and said, why do you come in every day? And he says, oh, it's just like being in a forest. And, you know, I work in an office and this is fantastic for me just to come in at lunchtime. And I feel like I'm in this forest because every time I come in, it's doing something different. So Yeah, I think the way that there are different works, and some need that mode of educating the person or enlightening the person on what the interaction is. But this work was sort of deliberately not trying to do that, I think.
Yeah, I mean, that makes, I think, perfect sense. I think for me and for the audience here, what I find really interesting is the idea of mapping beyond a kind of linear causality where it's easy to tell this goes into that, where you work in this kind of generative A-life approach probably a few years ago, and the generative approach, emergent behaviors and so on, where you're trying to define agents with specific behaviors that might be complex to understand, but still interesting, so that the mapping, it's kind of exponentially transformed into something a bit more complicated, and it's happening at different levels. So, I mean, answering, going back into the same question, maybe in some of these artworks, that the idea that people have to understand what's going on maybe is not so relevant. You're just trying to create this ecosystem that is a space they can inhabit, and then try to come out with something that it's meaningful for them. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, if you go for a walk in a forest, you can walk in the forest and just enjoy the aesthetics of the experience, or the phenomenological aspects of that experience, without having to understand all of the ecosystemic relationships between all of the organisms in that forest. It's just there. And so this was a sort of a way of thinking about things in those terms, that the work presents itself as a phenomenological experience of a dynamic system, and that has its own aesthetics, not just visual aesthetics, but sonic aesthetics and processual aesthetics. And if you care to find out more about it, you can, and that might enrich the experience further, or you don't have to do that, and you can still have something that you take away from it, that is just like walking in a forest, for example.
Do we have any questions from the audience? No?
Yes, one question.
I'll give the microphone to Torin.
Just in terms of like feedback in public-facing installation, usually when we think about feedback, it's something that you lose control of. If you get feedback on stage, it can get very loud and piercing. Or, I'm wondering how you contained the feedback in such a sense that all of the agents don't die, or the installation is filled with excruciating noise that evolved and scares the audience away. So maybe you can talk about how you guided the system in a way.
Yeah, sure. Great question. You probably don't remember, but in one of the slides when I had the feedback thing, I said that there was control over the feedback. So in the microphone example, yeah, of course, if you just point the microphone at the speaker, you get annoying feedback. But if you have something like a volume control between the microphone and the speaker, and you just keep it at the edge of feeding back, what actually happens is really interesting. You get all these kind of room tones starting to emerge, and it becomes quite musical. So it's a similar thing in the systems that I've developed. So one thing that I forgot when I first set it up was that the gallery closed at night. And of course, there's no people in the gallery at night. So of course, the entire ecosystem just dies and becomes extinct. So when we came back after the opening the next morning, it was just empty and making no sound, and there were no creatures left. So I had to cheat in that sense and just say, well, okay, the system only runs during the opening hours when there are people there. And also if, for example, no one's there and the entire population dies out, you cheat and just reseed it with new agents. But to get more directly to answer your question, that is basically the key of that kind of mapping, is writing that feedback in a way that you're transforming the output before it goes back into the input in a way that's not going to lead it to be really annoying, or to just, like in the audio example, just getting louder and louder and louder. It's just being critically underneath that point of where it notionally changes. So that's kind of the key, I guess, in terms of working with these processes, is working out how to do that.
Any other questions? We have one here.
Yeah, maybe one follow-up question on the feedback control. So when I think about the agent that you create and some other algorithm that other people create, they're similar to distributed computing, right? Where individual machine has their own rules and somehow they may have some emergence behavior, like a complex system. But when we talk about feedback, it's like more like a centralized computing unit that oversee the result. So what do you think about these very different regime of
Sorry, I missed the last part of the question.
So what do you think of the feedback control? Can it be also implemented in a way that, like what we implement in individual agent, that they can come together, create a emergent system?
Yeah, I think I get your question.
For me, because the feedback is like more global thing.
Yes. So there's
Sorry, I think, John, she's framing it, I think, as a tension between feedback and emergent behaviors. How do you play with that tension? Like the extent to which feedback becomes, starts working against emergent behaviors
okay. Yes, that's interesting. It all comes down to the design of how you design the system to do that. And so, when I presented the works, you notice they took a large number of years that I've been working on them. A lot of that time is not that I'm working on them all the time. It's just that you learn a lot about what makes things work and where they don't work. And I think if I understand the question, the idea of global feedback is kind of critical in terms of the resilience of the system. But I guess one of the things why it works is because they're adaptive. So they don't just have a fixed behavior with the same feedback. So if the feedback gets more intense, for example, they're able to adapt to that and change their behavior. And actually changing those things is the driver of diversity or change or variation in the system. So you can use it to work in your advantage by simply allowing the individual agents to be adaptive, or the system in total to be adaptive. And I guess that's, again, the biological metaphor. If you think about, global changes like the ones that we've got at the moment with climate change, those sorts of changes happened at a much slower rate throughout the history of life on Earth, and organisms adapted to that over time. So the rate of adaptation is obviously critical, and if something is changing too quickly, then it's very difficult for something to adapt to that change. So it's like the frog in the water getting boiled really slowly. You don't notice that the temperature's changing, so you can't adapt to it until it's too late. So yeah, there's a lot of critical things that you need to think about, but adaptation within that feedback loop is the key. And that was the homeostat that I showed. That was the kind of key insight that Ross Ashby had, I think, in terms of his homeostat, being able to maintain something constant in the face of the feedback actually changing.
Thank you.
Anyone else? No? Maybe? No? Well, thank you, John. I mean, I think for us, it's amazing to have you here. To me, kind of the multimodality of your work is kind of inherent to the fact that you work across, the visual domain, sound, software development, hardware development. Like, you've done everything, and you've been creating all of these really interesting artworks that touch on so many relevant aspects of what we're trying to explore here. So thank you very much for being here. It's a true honor. I'll let Peter say goodbye.
I don't really have anything else I could say other than what Roberto said. But once again, Jon, thank you so much for joining us and for being the first speaker of the first event. It was a wonderful way to, I think, do what we wanted today to do, which is to get into a mode of thinking, which I think your presentation set the stage perfectly. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Peter and Roberto, and thanks everyone. It was a real pleasure. I'm sorry I can't be there in person, but I really hope the rest of the workshops are a big success. So thank you for inviting me. It was fantastic.
Thank you, Jon. Thanks, Jon. Take care. Okay, so Roberto, shall I just jump into this?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
Oh, so we're going to give a reasonably short talk on our own collaboration. So let's just jump straight into it. So Roberto and I have a collaboration which has been going now we met a little bit before we started at Hong Kong Baptist University, where we both work, which puts us back to something like early 2019. We've been kicking a ball back and forth between myself, my background is as a painter, and then working in computer graphics. Roberto as how would you describe yourself?
Nowadays, I don't know. I used to be a musician back in the days. Nowadays, it's kind of difficult.
A headless chicken was the last description I heard.
Mike the chicken, yeah?
I would describe you as a musician.
Without a head for 18 months, that's me.
A musician who also knows how to turn things on, something like that.
There you go.
That could be read the wrong way. Right, so there's a few projects we're going to run through, which I think for a lot of artists is how we learn how to do things, how we build technological solutions that we didn't know we needed, is coming up with an idea for a project and then realizing it has a lot of holes in it, and filling those holes is sort of, or filling these gaps, I think has led to, I guess, the knowledge base that our collaboration has.
Yeah. So I think, I mean, the question that Peter was raising about, what do I do, who am I, has to do with the fact that we do a bunch of different things. And that includes electronics, developing electronics, sensors and so on, software development, artistic practice at different levels. So we move beyond these different domains, and that's part of the reason why we have all of this experience related to multimodal mapping, because all of these different parts involve a kind of know-how that allows us to connect things and to explore connections and so on. Yeah.
Yeah. So let's. This is. There's quite a few friends in the audience, so some of you probably know some of these works. This is a short creative reel of some of our performances, and what we've just added in a few little descriptions of some of the techniques we're using. In the creative projects, we're going to go through some of these projects, give them a short introduction, and then towards the end of the presentation, we're going to discuss some of the technological tools that we've developed over the course of making these projects. Okay, so we'll go through these projects chronologically, basically because with each project we do, like any logical person, I think we often reuse approaches we develop in one project and then we sort of build on it and improve it in the other. So maybe Roberto, you're the musician.
Yeah, this is a project from 2022. Later we'll explain what we use here. Mainly we're embedding sensors into traditional musical instruments. This is one of the projects we developed where the sensors are embedded into a violin bow. There's actually, if you fancy reading some research, there's an article coming out next month on Computer Music Journal, and it's a special issue, and this is going to be kind of the main article discussing how we embedded sensors into a violin bow without modifying the structure of the bow. So the idea here was quite simple. We have classical music people out there. They've been trying to learn to play this instrument for 20 years, and they want to keep playing it. If you modify it, they are not going to use your tool. So we've embedded these sensors into a bow that is exactly the same, and then we talked to this string quartet, European string quartet, ASISA, of some really amazing players that are now working in different places. She's the concertmaster of the Spanish National Orchestra. She's a professor in German, Hochschule, really great players, to perform Shostakovich quartet with the bows. And we developed in Dutch designer a patch that mapped the movement to some really interesting, we believe, visuals. We tried to make something meaningful and nice. And we invited them to test the bows, perform with them, and that was mainly the project. So what you can see here is them using the bows with embedded technology, and then on the screen you have real-time visualization of their movements.
Yeah, and it's funny that Jon showed Alon Ilsar's drum project, because we know Alon through a completely separate mechanism. A friend of mine who runs a record label, when we were telling him about this idea of trying to put the sensors inside the violin bow, he's like, oh, you've got to talk to my friend Alon. He's been trying to do that with drumsticks for years. And we had this very funny conversation with Alon where he said, don't make hardware devices. It will drive you crazy, but it's also really fun, which is exactly, I think, the situation we've been in.
I mean, I think some of the early questions that we had with this project that we still have, and we'll discuss that later. What types of data do you use? Where do you get your data from? And using sensors in general is a noisy environment. So there's a lot of cleaning that has to be done, sensor fusion in this case, learning what the best approach to visualize something might be, and thinking about variables. So this was an early experiment at filtering some of that, making something meaningful out of it, learning how to relate it to the data, how to clean it, how to,
And also with a really, from my perspective, I'm not a musician, a really odd fixed outcome, that it's a Shostakovich piece, it's in a genre of music with performance conventions. So we had creative problems of what should the graphics look like. We had to reach out to a bunch of people to help kind of augment our ideas to something that made sense and worked. And then, as Roberto was saying, the reason we've made this little GIF of what our OSC inputs are is, there's always this tug of war of some of the raw data coming out of a sensor can be really useful in one domain and completely useless in another, just depending on the types of movements people are doing. And then we get into the complexity of processing that data into things like linear acceleration or quaternion rotations that have their own issues. So these things, it leads to, for us, quite a fun back and forth of being very specific in what motion we can grab, and we love the idea that the sensor is tiny and hidden, but then what we do with it. And with all of these streams, trying to find the one that matches what we're trying to express, which is completely an artistic problem. It's not a technological problem, but the bridge is this sort of trying to build the right logical connection, which in a way is sort of what inspired us to design the workshop and performance series in this way. It's trying to do this
later we'll explore that this led to questioning the actual mechanics of the elements themselves. What is an accelerometer? How does it work? What type are we going to be using? Because we developed our own board with our own kind of combination of elements. So understanding how the data is being generated is also important. Otherwise, it's just floating numbers that absolutely. So looking at the mechanics of the sensors themselves was quite relevant as well. Yeah.
And we did some tests with the quartet in things that are more common with like demonstrations of IMUs is, like a rotating cube. And so a twist on that was to replace the 3D model of the cube with the 3D model of a violin bow. And even here, like, it's pretty good, but it's also quite noisy. So like there would be a degree of like, how much do we filter? How much do we smooth the data? How much latency does that introduce? And what's the sweet spot between that? And then what's the range of motion where that mapping starts to not work so well? And then you get into the strange limitations of the sensors themselves, that if you rotate something a full 180 degrees, the quality of that data outside that range might not be as good as it was within that sort of sweet spot. So these things were kind of interesting to work with a bunch of musicians so they could see exactly what this sensor was doing. But then in the performance, it didn't really make sense. It made more sense to sort of work with graphics in a more abstract way.
Yep.
Okay, I'll go to the next one. So this is a project that we started in the middle of COVID, and when I guess like everybody working creatively, the projects you made during COVID all have a different spin on them because everything you did was sort of defined by it, from how you rehearsed, how you performed.
Well, I mean, this performance down here, that's me after 21 days of quarantine, coming out direct into the rehearsal and then recording until 5 a.m. So
I think actually
my brain there was...
in the video that's in the next slide, we see that and you look like
I look great. Okay.
Kind of dead. This was a project we did. Some of you would know Sudi Liao. She's a dancer, was based in Hong Kong for quite some time. She's in Singapore at the moment. We worked with Sudi quite a lot on and off. And in this performance, this really started as something we were doing at nighttime or on the weekends, originally with an Xbox Kinect of like me playing around in graphics, you and Sudi performing together and us seeing what sort of fun we could have by mapping those things together. And then at one point, as universities tend to do, university was looking for a project to expand, and so we offered them this. And we got to take it to a higher degree of complexity by looking at generated motion using a motion capture suite and AI-generated motion. So this is a quick short of that, and I think you do get to see Roberto looking like he's been in a hotel for 3 weeks.
My name is Sudi Liao. I'm a choreographer and movement artist from Singapore, currently based in Hong Kong. My project Capture and Release will examine the epistemology of motion capture and the cultural locatedness of technologically augmented performance. In 2021, Roberto, Alonso, Peter Nelson and I began developing Descendant, a piece for dance, violin, motion capture and AI-generated motion. Using a musical, choreographic and visual interpretation of the Promethean myth, Descendant became a live performance for exploring gesture, communication and agency. It also introduced important questions concerning how we record, categorize and access motion data, especially in the age of generative machine learning models. We created a dataset of my own dance practice coded with Laban notation and paired to phrasings in classical violin. The result was a system that could visualize my own motion as well as that of an AI-generated avatar moving in response to live violin performance. Using an interpretation of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein and the Prometheus saga, Descendant explored questions of knowledge systems, procreation and identity via interdisciplinary and cross-cultural collaboration. Descendant provided me with the ability to dance with an AI version of myself, but also raises questions concerning how datasets are defined and what knowledge systems are used to train AI models. In recent performances, we have experimented with DIY wearable technologies, as well as remixing fragments from critical debates surrounding technology and access into the performance itself.
Okay, so that project, I think the things that we probably, some of the trickier mapping questions on my side were, if anybody here works in graphics, probably some simple things like, parenting rigs to skeletons, the generated motion, often when used for testing, is used on a robot rig. Often half of the limbs are facing backwards, people don't notice. There was stuff there, but I think some of the more interesting questions were what you and Sudhi had to do in mapping motion to music through Lubber notation. Like as Sudhi was talking about, the data set itself, in how do you, to make a training data set, maybe you can talk about how the hell do you make like a tagged data set of these two domains?
This project has been discussed on a book that was published in January 2024 called Choreomata. There are 2 chapters there that discuss this project from 2 different perspectives. Key complexity of the project is a mapping mechanism that translates. Ideally, it was planned to be in a kind of 2-directional way. Mocap data from dance that has been organized into something where gestures have some sort of meaning using a Laban approach into sound features. So the idea that you have sound going into the system, analyze sound in real time, and then translate that into chains of mocap data that would be like an AI version of the dancer. The idea that you also do the opposite, you have real-time mocap data going into the system, and then you should be able to generate sounds that would be the natural pair to that mocap data. We only explored, I think, the first part. The second part was never fully explored, but that's the idea. It's a translation between a semantic space that has to do with dance and then one that is music. And
thinking back, one interesting gap that we sort of found was that because there's plenty of work done in this space to make computer-generated motion that can dance to music, because it's super valuable, has a huge commercial application. And I think almost all of it was just mapped to beat recognition. Wasn't that basically the space that...
Rhythm.
Onset?
Yeah, onsets, yeah.
Difference being...
No, it's the same. Yeah,
Okay. So what we found in like the existing training data sets there was this artistic gap that dancing, especially as soon as you look at contemporary dance, it's not dancing to a beat. So none of this made any sense. So this sort of process that Roberto and Sudhi went through of a musician and a dancer who've worked together enough that you've played and Sudhi will sort of choreograph motion to that. There was something implicit that you had to make explicit. And that was a kind of an unexpected challenge in mapping that I think made a really nice contribution of like, okay, there's this system of Lubber notation. You can make it a tagged data set that is something more than a generated motion kind of bopping along to a beat in various styles.
Yes. So the state of the art at the time was mainly to do with I think rap music or like pop music that had really clear rhythmic structures, and it was based mainly on onset detection. So it had to do with the rhythm of the music. And the question in this project that we kind of have developed with the computer science team from the university was, can we think differently from a kind of spectral, more complex, more holistic perspective? So that it's not about dancing jazz or dancing, this type of hip hop or that or the other thing. It's a bit more kind of open question where you can fit completely experimental music into the system and still get dance that is meaningful.
Well, I think so one thing Sudhi was talking about there was like ethical or aesthetic questions in how data sets are recorded and tagged, that the assumption that dance is simply like matching your movement to a beat is incredibly reductive. And so going into some of these processes and questioning, well, that's it? That's all that dance is? That was, I think, a really nice outcome of saying, obviously, you talk to a dancer, that is a huge reduction. And so therefore, if the entire model is based on that assumption, then the results are going to be as limited as the assumption.
Yeah, so I mean, as you may assume, part of what we had to do here was come up, because that was the approach, it was a conditional kind of approach, was to come up with labels to define different types of music or dance. And that part of that was a fight with the computer scientists when they would come to you and say, okay, give me happy and sad music label. And you're like, it's a bit too simple, yes. We might have to find labels that are a bit more meaningful and that relate in a more interesting way to the musical content. And the same with dance. So part of what we had to do was come up with a labeling system that was a bit more comprehensive than the standard and a bit more meaningful for us as artists, so that the mappings would be more interesting.
Yeah. I'll skip ahead.
Yeah.
So this is moving a bit ahead, but it's partly because a lot of projects we work on, by the time they get to exhibition, some part of them has been in process for a while. So they overlap, which I guess is normal for anybody who makes anything. So this is a shot from one of the classrooms at BU, but it's using some of the bridging software that Roberto and I had developed, which in this case is simply to connect IMU development board to some of the robotic arms that we've been teaching with the Baptist University. And this, bits and pieces of these bridges have been developed across two projects. One of them, our work with the violin bow, which was a bridge to send OSC data through a Bluetooth low energy, low latency bridging app. And then the second one is to, we're bridging through Touch Designer, taking that OSC data in, and then using a second bridging app that's been put together by a colleague and friend of ours, Daniel Stempfer, which then sends an OSC message to the robotic arm as positional data. This is the first version we had, which was just sending basically the position of the end of the robot. Now we have one that can do far more degrees of freedom of movement. But the goal in this, again, is to map one domain into another, which will eventually be a robot that can either paint or play an instrument and so on. But in just getting to here, it had a whole bunch of little, not only sort of plugs that we had to develop, but working out which piece of data would logically make a logical translation into which actuation. Roberto, do you want to add anything onto this?
So, if you are not busy on June 12th,
oh, good call.
You may as well witness this in real time, hopefully. It will. And we have a performance on June 12th at the Visualization Research Center at HKBU, where we're going to be doing real-time distributed data transmission to control both sound, DSP, the robot arm, and a bunch of other things. And it's going to be a really cool performance where the robot will be placed inside this unique new cinematic space developed by Jeffrey, who was here earlier. And we're going to be doing, I think, really interesting things. We'll have 3 performances, so if you want to join, we'll share details. It's going to be like 15 minutes each, something like that. We just walk into the space. The performance lasts 15 minutes, and then we have some snacks and we can talk and discuss that.
Yeah, I described this performance as its motivation is sort of, we had this project, it's another COVID project where we wanted to do research. At that time, we described it as remote collaboration, development of small applications for remote collaboration, because that's what everybody was doing in COVID, and Hong Kong had a funny head start on that we seemed to start COVID earlier than everybody and finish it later than everybody. So this type of research, there was a huge call for it, and so that's why we were able to get some funding to do it. But what it ended out as being was a whole bunch of these small bridging systems that can just allow, the OSC bridge that we had to not just simply be a local solution, but be an international online solution. So looking at who has made protocols for sending that same type of signal low latency online, and then bundling that into some of the other bridging software that we've made. So the performance has this sort of, can we get this to work quality to it, which we hope doesn't crush the aesthetic quality of it. But I think in some works, this is, it's really like a, can we turn everything on at once and see if it all works? Because then after that, we'll understand the utility of all these components. And I think it's a real, like a stress test for them, is how I describe it.
Doing something like this might seem easy. I mean, it's been done in the past and stuff. But a movement as simple as moving a bow over a string and making sound that has good quality, it's a great challenge for a robot. Because the amount of complexity that goes at weight level into controlling how sound is being produced is quite interesting. Different variables. So we've been testing this for a while. And Daniel, the other day, he was telling me, you know, the robot is not so good with superhuman movements, which is what you do when you play. So we're trying to fine-tune that, but there is a complexity to interacting with a string that as soon as you modify a parameter by a 1%, the sound breaks. And that's why, you know, when you listen to a young kid playing the violin, it's usually not very...
Yeah, and there's incredible things you learn about, like the inertia of movement, that as Roberto bows a string, the acceleration, deceleration, and the release of the string, the complexity of trying to replicate that forces us to improve every protocol we have for using a piece of equipment. So there's a sort of, I'd say some of these projects are designing something that's deliberately a little impractical but fun, but in doing so the capability of how to use these things we think improves reasonably well. So this is the last part of the talk. We'll probably just go for another 5 or 6 minutes. Just on the sensors that after a while, after using some development boards, it seemed logical in our own spare time to make some sensors of our own. And Roberto's really been leading the charge on this, so.
Yes, so we use some of our solutions. I guess if any of you have used IMUs in the past, you probably dislike them, which is perfectly fine. I think the idea with sensors here is, I mean, for you to understand that we've used not only IMUs, we've used, you know, cameras to extract data. We have a bunch of sensors at the university, ECG, EEG, and so on, that was also used. We use a lot of sound features that are extracted in real time. We developed a tool last year that, you know, is a comprehensive implementation of the Sensia library, where you can extract so many different things. But the focus on the IMU had to do with some of the projects we were developing and the issues that we found with the boards that you have out there. What is unique about this board is size, which is 21 millimeters by 13, 5 layers, BLE connectivity, and what makes it a bit more interesting is that there are not many boards, well, there's no board at this size that incorporates this little guy here, which is a really cool piece of, it's a really cool chip because it does compute sensor fusion in the board. So these board outputs already like quaternions that are really clean, as well as raw data, and that allows us to work directly with the pre-computed, let's put it that way, data, but also to modify sensor fusion if we want on the end device. So we've been working on this for a while. It has a microphone, different questions, how to integrate. We were trying to integrate, and we have integrated raw data, like IMU sensor data and audio into a single Bluetooth characteristic to simplify the process where we decodify all of that and latency becomes a bit smaller. How to codify, you know, the codec for the audio and so on to maintain the quality. So a bunch of different questions that have been answered. Another important aspect of what we do, we were showing it before, and this is just for the IMU, but this is a more kind of general question for everyone. Data. What types of data are we using? Why? To what extent is the data that we use relevant? And how we map it? Yes, the idea is that in principle you can map anything to anything, but then, you know, that's not something that is maybe truly interesting from an artistic point of view. So what are you going to map? What type of data are you using? How are you extracting it? And so on seems to be really important for the kind of work that we've been trying to do. So data is a big question. It seems like a given, like a scientific, extraction of elements from sensors and so on. But understanding the data, cleaning it,
Yeah. And the one thing I'd add to that I hope that over these seminars we can tease out a little bit, and it was partly the motivation of my question to Jon, which was I have really mixed feelings on things like data visualization or data-based artwork, or something where the interaction is either unclear or incredibly clear. And to me, I have my feelings about these, but I'm not attached to them. But for example, a data visualization where if you swapped out one set of information for another and people couldn't tell the difference, or it just looked like another form of abstraction, is that a less successful artwork? Or is it simply okay that what you made is beautiful and that people can kind of appreciate the presence of this information? Or does the visualizing of data have some obligation in terms of communication in the way that a graph or a chart might do? And artwork is not a graph, so to what degree, and this I think is an open question, but one that I'm quite interested in, to what degree is the communication through the mapping important for the artist and for the audience? And I'd put the same on interactivity, that my bias is towards things like computer games where I think part of the fun of interactivity is knowing what your relationship to this system is, knowing what the button does or something like that. However, like I totally can see the virtue in Jon's answer, that if the system is sort of recording an interaction that doesn't require this prior knowledge, then there's an absolute value in that approach, but to me they're sort of different. So this question of like whether the mapping, to what degree the mapping communicates or doesn't, is one also that I hope over these seminars and then in the works that start getting made in the second half of this program, I would love to sort of build up a base of knowledge and opinions on these type of questions.
And I think that's both an artistic and kind of aesthetic decision. But we are aware of the fact, we've been working on lately a lot on Touch Designer, where we have a switch. So, where we have two versions of the same patch, and the switch is just going to change between pre-generated noise and real data. If you're using the noise and you're not realizing, like you forgot to switch on so that you use the proper data, then something it's not working there. So we're usually trying to be honest in that sense, avoiding noise as a kind of starting point and trying to find connections that are meaningful.
Okay, and then the last part on the use of bridging tools. These are things that I think Roberto has really been incredible at identifying gaps and solving them. So Roberto, you can go through.
Yes, we've developed the question is how to get data from sensors and transform it into something relevant. OSC is a protocol that is commonly used nowadays. It's quite useful, quite powerful. There are others, but we chose OSC as the way to connect Bluetooth devices to our computer and then send out data in a clean, low latency approach. And what we did as well is we implemented something that was developed originally in Canada by Michael Palombo, that is called All Hands, which is an OSC over the internet low latency transmission mechanism. So what we have now...
Is that on the video? Do you want me to
it's on the next one, yeah.
Okay, yeah.
What we have now...
That's a video, is that?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, cool.
Is this where you can connect a device and immediately send data to the cloud with low latency, so that anyone else in the world can get that data in real time with really low latency. It's not zero, but it's low enough for it to be something that you can use in a kind of meaningful way. So here we connect the device, we select incoming, outgoing, we tell it to display the data, and then data streaming. If you join this same app elsewhere and you use the password that I put in there, you have access to my data in real time. So that's something that we're going to demonstrate on June 12th, where we will have someone outside of the space controlling with a sensor something that is happening in the space in real time. That's part of the idea.
And I think it's a funny world that we're like a generation after telemetry being really difficult. there's important works in the history of media art of, setting up a live video stream between two places, and we live in the age of video calls and Zoom and so on. But there's some perverse pleasure that we find in being able to do that with things that aren't like audio and sound and vision. So I think that's also part of the fascination, is that this little sensor, stick it in your pocket, stick it in a musical instrument, blue tack it to the bottom of a table, and all of a sudden you're having that same telemetry experience, just with a data format that's not the one that's super easy, but gives a huge amount of flexibility. And one type of motion can become the type of motion for a robot, or the type of motion on a screen, and so on.
Yeah, so this is a taster of the space where we're going to be performing on June 12th. I think some of you, I know Torin knows the space, and I guess Brian as well. This is high-speed version of a performance we did 2 weeks ago. That's in the space. And with the bow here, I'm controlling sound and lights. There is no sound because I had to accelerate the whole thing. But each time that I do something with the bow, something is happening, audio reactive visuals, and so on. It's a really amazing space, and it's a pleasure to work in there. It's a bit overwhelming, but that's what happens when you're surrounded by screens.
Yeah. Okay, so just so that we can sort of get ourselves back on time, maybe we should switch over to questions, and then our
Yes, please.
next presenter. So obviously we'll be here for the next 2 years doing this project, but are there any questions that people have for anything we've discussed so far?
Give us a sneak peek of for the next 2 years, other than workshops and stuff. Like, can you share a little bit more and give us a preview?
A sneak peek. I'll grab the microphone.
Sneak peek of
the question was, can we have a bit more information about what the workshops and performance program will be?
Yes.
So what we proposed to do was to develop a series of performances based on the very broad topic of multimodal mapping, with a very broad range of potential artists who might like to work on something like this. But we didn't want to lock down exactly what that would be. So the approach that we applied with, and thankfully we got accepted, was to start like this, and to start with a bunch of conversations, looking up some artists that we know that we would really like to have talk, but then asking a whole lot of people, hey, this is the topic, and who do you think would be interesting to sort of have them present, and then just see how that goes first. And then from there, the plan is to start seeing what type of group of people might make an interesting performance, and then build on top of that. Yeah. We were trying to be, in the world of, in our life of applying for grant money for creative projects, it can be very difficult to build in something that's emergent into the plan. It's often, you have to know exactly what's going to happen before you do it, which for scientific research is a little paradoxical, but also I'd argue for creative. So what we said is, this is how we're going to do it. We know that it'll be performances in this type of domain. We want to start by actually just talking like this, and we're going to make a series. So from here, there'll be a series of online, like YouTube lectures that we'll sort of edit this into, and that will become a body of knowledge, and then we'll move on to getting closer towards performance. Does that?
Yeah, so performances, we have one in December this year. Next year, fall, we're going to Australia, Spain, coming back to Hong Kong. And then there'll be a final performance eventually in 2026. And then with regards to the workshops, we have a series of 10 workshops up to the December this year. The first 2 are more like an intro. And then from September, we'll have workshops where we're going to be making things. So the idea there is to have artists, computer scientists and programmers, and fight.
And hopefully,
fight, yeah. And hopefully, eventually, we have an idea of what we want to do, but that dialogue to us is very important. So that's how we designed the whole thing. From September, it's more of a hands-on, let's come in with ideas, let's test things, let's, do things. Yeah,
Yeah, well, we spent a lot of time talking about this model of we didn't want to have the thing be too predictive and say it's going to end up exactly like that. But we know, I've been in Hong Kong for about 8 years, but I don't have an encyclopedic knowledge of everybody working with particular practices, and I'm also not a curator, so that's puts us in a difficult space. So, and you never really even know what combinations of people are going to end up in something interesting. But we thought, okay, well, let's put all of that right at the forefront of our application and say, this is how we think this would work. And we've tried to structure workshops and seminars and stuff to sort of, we think it will work. We think it's kind of logical. But that's how we're doing it, and why there is a slightly mysterious relationship between workshops to performances, but it's to try to actually let some, I guess, to take Jon's language, emergence occur. That's why we're doing it this way. And even with the speakers today, we've really looked for quite established practitioners, people who were like, this would be an amazing way to set the tone. And that's, I guess, the underlying design of today. And then each one will have a slightly different feel to try to get to that final goal.
Yeah, I mean, it's a capacity grant. So the idea is to build capacity. And there's so much amazing stuff going on in Hong Kong that we know some of it. We know some people elsewhere. So trying to bring everyone together and create stuff together. And an example of this is the next presenter, who is Rebecca Fiebrink, who is not with us tomorrow because she couldn't be today. Today she couldn't be here today. Rebecca, I guess maybe you know who she is. Right now she's a professor at the University of the Arts, London. We have a colleague from SCM moving there, SCM in a few weeks, Daniel, to teach in London. She's a really interesting scholar, researcher, artist. She was teaching before at Goldsmiths, and she's one of the pioneers on a key element to me that relates to mapping, which is applying machine learning in an interactive way to arts development in general. So she developed a tool that is called Wikinator a few years ago that has been extensively used. The idea of Wikinator is interactive machine learning that anyone can use, easy interface, and something that is quite important for us artists, which is machine learning models that are shallow. So the idea that you create your own database and you train that and you work with that. The idea that Rebecca brings into the equation is that we like to work on a kind of iterative approach where you test something, you modify it. You test it again, you modify it. So the ability to modify the database, training mechanisms, and so on is very important. This one?
This one?
Yeah.
Fabulous. Okay.
Hi there, I'm Rebecca Fiebrink. I'm a professor at the Creative Computing Institute at University of the Arts London. And today I'm going to be talking about interactive machine learning as a tool for making musical instruments, embodied experiences, and interactive art. Now, of course, lots of people are talking about creative applications of machine learning right now, but many of them are asking questions that make me a little bit sad, like, are machines really capable of being creative or making real music or art? Or isn't it terrible there will be no more jobs for creative people? I think these are the wrong questions to ask. And in fact, the questions that I've been focusing on in my research for the last 20 years or so have really been around how might people use machine learning within their own existing creative practices? And how might machine learning expand people's creative capabilities? These are really questions about when and why it might be creatively useful to find patterns, make predictions, or generate new data, because this is what machine learning really is at the end of the day. Now, one way into answering these questions is to think about what types of data are useful or interesting in different types of creative practice. And when you start looking for such data, you find out that it's everywhere. And creators can benefit in many ways when they are able to work more effectively with this data. When I began this research in 2008, I was working with musicians who were interested in building new musical instruments and other performance interfaces. They were using sensors like these to capture information about how performers moved their bodies, then writing software to translate those movements into sound. Soon after, I noticed that people in other fields were tackling essentially the same type of engineering problems. A dancer might want to capture and track her movements, for example, to coordinate lighting or other effects. Or a game designer might want to use physical actions of players rather than simple button presses to control gameplay. As many of you know, devices like these on screen can make getting raw data about human actions easy. However, if you've ever tried to build an interactive interface with this data, you know that interpreting it or mapping it to meaningful control over sound or image or other processes, this can be difficult and annoying, even for people with deep expertise in programming and signal processing. Now, a lot of the systems we might want to build with data can be thought of as having some kind of mapping, where the computer sees some kind of data in the world, maybe an input to the computer, and then it makes a decision about what to do as a result, what to output. For instance, if I'm building a new musical instrument, I might want the computer to produce different sounds based on the gesture I'm performing. Or I might want the computer to listen to the sound of a human musician and then map this to control over live visuals or lighting. Or I may want to make a game that responds to a player's motions or speech, for instance, triggering different in-game actions. It turns out that all of these are a great fit for a type of machine learning called supervised learning. Supervised learning allows us to build a model or mapping function which looks at data coming in and makes a decision about what values to output. For instance, this model here could look at data from my webcam, try to decide what gesture I'm making, and then choose which sound a music program should play. Instead of having to write this function by hand as a programmer, however, we can instead use a machine learning algorithm to build this function from examples of inputs and outputs, of sensor data and musical choices. So here I could give some examples maybe of different hand positions, each one paired with the sound I want to result from that position. In 2008, I built a tool called Wekinator to allow musical instrument builders and other creators to use machine learning to build these types of mapping functions. Wekinator allows you to do a few things that are pretty unusual in more mainstream machine learning systems used outside of creative practice. First, Wekinator allows you to demonstrate these training examples in real time, showing the computer yourself what kinds of behavior you want. Second, once you've built a model function from your examples, you can try it out. For instance, move around in real time and see what kinds of sounds your instrument makes. If you like what it does, great, you can use the model in performance. But if you don't like it, Wekinator allows you to change the model function by changing the training data, by adding new examples and then retraining the algorithm on that new data. For instance, if I find that my model makes a mistake when I have my hand slightly tilted, I can just add more training examples showing the correct sound to make when my hand is tilted. Let's do some demos.
All right, in this demo, I'm going to build a very simple gesture-controlled drum machine using Wekinator. As my input device to capture information about gesture, I'm going to use my webcam. And I've got a little program here which I like to call the world's worst computer vision feature extractor. What I'm doing is just taking those pixels coming in from the webcam and downsampling that to a 10 by 10 grid of color values. And this gives me 100 numbers, and these numbers are going to change as I move in front of the camera, as you see. But even if you're an amazing programmer, I would guess that you would not want the job of writing the program that looks at these 100 values and says something useful about what I am doing in front of the camera. So instead, we're going to use machine learning to make sense of these 100 values and make pretty accurate predictions about what kinds of gestures or motions I'm doing. All right, so I'm going to have Wekinator here listen to 100 values from this camera program. And I'm going to build a classifier, which is going to, again, predict what type of action am I doing at the moment. And we're not going to load a training set from somewhere else. We're actually going to build this training set right from scratch in the demo. And I want to, not just have Wekinator output a number. I want to have this control a sound and make this a little bit fun, right? We're going to control a drum machine, like I said. So I'm going to run a very simple drum machine program written in Chuck. And when I send this drum machine different numbers, we're going to hear different sounds, just like this. All right, so let's start out. Let's give it some training examples. And I'm going to say that when I am right here in front of the camera, I want to hear this simple sound. So I've got 17 snapshots of me here paired with this sound. And next I'm going to tell it that when I'm not in front of the camera, turn that down so you can hear. When I'm not in front of the camera, when I'm out of frame, I want to play a different sound, specifically this one. Let's go. Okay, now I've trained, I've built my model. Let's run this model and see what happens. Okay, it's pretty good. It's definitely changing between the two sounds, more or less the way I'd like it to. However, it's being a little bit too eager to change to that second sound, even when I'm not totally out of frame yet. So I'm going to give it some more training examples to try to fix that error and say that when I'm right here, actually I still want to hear the first sound. And now I'll retrain, I'll rebuild that model, and we'll see if it works any better. And in fact, that's pretty good. I can keep moving around and see if I can make it make other mistakes, like right here. I can, oops, forget I did that. Let's give this as sound 1 and say that I want sound 1 over here. And I can retrain and keep running and see that, yes, it's doing what I'd like. And once I'm happy with that, maybe I want to make it more complicated. I could give it another sound with, say, my hand in front of the camera, like this. Okay, there we go. That is a pretty easy way of using Wekinator to make a classifier where I'm controlling a few different sounds based on simple movements of my body. All right, so that demo I just showed you was pretty fun. You can imagine that, for an audience, watching somebody move on the stage is probably more interesting than watching them just change sound by clicking a mouse button. And in the hands of a good choreographer, you can imagine something that becomes really visually compelling as well as sonically interesting. But when professional composers have used Wekinator, they're using it in a slightly different way, often to exploit the fact that you can use machine learning to build very different types of instruments. The sounds that you heard in the previous instrument were the same sounds that I could easily make by just pressing a few buttons to switch between different sound options. But sound becomes a lot more fun to many electronic composers when you can explore a really big space of sounds, when you've got a large palette to draw from and you can come up with ways of playing sound that are much more nuanced, much more complex, more exciting than just switching between a few different presets. So in this demo, I'm going to show you how you can use Wekinator with regression to do exactly that. And the instrument we're going to play is going to control a sound synthesis algorithm called Blotar. And Blotar is fun because it has a lot of different sounds that it's capable of making. So here's just a few of the Blotar sounds. Okay, and for each of these sounds, I'm getting that sound by giving Blotar a different set of control parameters. Specifically, I'm changing 9 of its control parameters. So you can think of each of those sounds as a point in a 9-dimensional space. And I'm going to build a Blotar instrument where I control these sounds using this. This is a game track controller from an old PlayStation game called Real World Golf. But we're just going to use it as essentially a 6-axis joystick. I get X, Y, and length of each of these 2 strings that I pull out of the bass here. And so I'm going to tell Wekinator I want to take these 6 input values and use them to control those 9 Blotar parameters. And I'm going to use regression so I get smooth changes. And of course, this is, again, something that would be really hard to do even for someone who's an expert programmer, because not only are you trying to find good positions in this 9-dimensional space, but you're trying to come up with a mapping function that says how the motions that somebody's doing here move you through that space in a way that's not only musically interesting, but maybe gesturally comfortable, where the gestural mapping might be easy to learn or easy to execute certain gestures that give you sonic gestures, and so on. So that's very hard to think about as a programmer. It's a complex function to write, but here we can do it pretty easily with machine learning. So I'm going to start out by finding a sound that I want to put in the blowtar. And maybe I want that sound, and I'm just going to put it over here pretty comfortably. Record some examples, and maybe another sound higher in pitch, say over here. You can record some examples here, and just training from these, you understand what's going to start happening. Okay, so I've got smooth change, and it's learned that lower pitch is over here, higher pitch is over here. That's fine, not too interesting yet. Let's start to add more sounds in and see what happens. Put this sound over here. Should mention this is taking a little bit longer than usual to train because I'm running my video capture software at the same time. Okay, so hopefully you saw some interesting stuff happening there. Not only was it giving me access roughly to the sounds that I put in the training set, and still having this behavior that when my hand was kind of back here, I was getting a low to high pitch relationship, but it was also giving me all sorts of other sounds as I moved between these very, very different timbres, which I'd put in different parts of my gesture space. I was getting sounds that I didn't put in the training set that I have never heard before, even though I do this demo quite frequently. And this means that I can start gesturally exploring the space of this synthesis algorithm. And of course, I can use machine learning to refine this instrument or this mapping that I've created. If I like a sound somewhere, I say, oh, that's a really cool sound and I like it where it is. I can add more training examples of that pair to reinforce that behavior. Or if I don't like a sound somewhere, I say, oh, that's silly, that's silent, or that's just really stupid sounding. I can put a different sound in that part of the gesture space and retrain it, and I'll get a different instrument. And I can keep refining my instrument in this way until I'm happy with it. Then I can save the whole thing and run it, the models as they are during performance. Or perhaps I could even write a piece, and I've done this a few times in the past, where a performer retrains the instrument on stage, and the evolving relationship between sound and gestures is part of a piece. But most composers don't do that. Most composers spend a fair amount of time refining the instrument until it's something that they're happy with, and then they move on and do other aspects of the work.
Now, Wekinator has been used by thousands, tens of thousands of people all around the world in making creative work in music and many other domains. I want to show you some examples of this work. In all of these, machine learning is used to unlock the creative potential of data, making it easier for people to build systems that respond to human actions or the environment. The first example I'll show you is from Michelle Nagai. She built an amazing instrument called Martlet from a piece of tree bark. Here you go.
Basically taking the data and it's comparing it to examples that I've given it in the past of relationships between a certain data and a certain gesture and a certain sound. So if I train the machine learning software that when I wrap my arms around the instrument and the sensors register less light, it makes a particular kind of sound, and then full light, it makes a different kind of sound. So I give it all these examples in the training process, and then I run it and I see what happens. And it takes the data that's coming in and says, oh, that looks just like the data, or that's similar to the data that she has when she wants this sound. So it sends that message to my sound processor, and the computer outputs that sound. So it's just another way, basically, of mapping gesture to sound.
This next piece I'll show you is from Handwriting, or Wuxing, by Han Shuo Fan. In this piece, the performer's hands are measured using a leap motion sensor, and as the performer does different gestures associated with Chinese calligraphy, the sound and the visuals behind the performer change. This is an interactive art piece made with Wekinator. In this piece, you wear a camera on your head. That camera sends information about what's in your field of view to Wekinator. And there's a classifier, a model inside Wekinator that decides whether or not you're looking at a screen, whether there's a phone or television or laptop in your field of view. And if there is, it sends a message to these special glasses you're wearing and tells them to turn opaque. So this is an art piece that prevents you from looking at screens. This is an example of a demonstration of a game made by one of my students a couple years ago. This uses a tool called InteractML, which is based on Wekinator but made for use in game engines. In this example, you'll see that the input to the machine learning model is the position of your character on the screen, and this model is controlling objects in the game environment based on where you are. So it makes a really different kind of interactive puzzle. You have to figure out how to move through the space to get the objects where you want them to be. So here you see the stairs and these cones moving around as you move. This is another game example from a student of mine, Isabella Mound. Here she made a spellcasting game. And this one, you just play with your mouse, but you can draw different patterns on screen with your mouse chosen from a spell book. And as you draw them, the computer tries to identify which spell you're casting. If you happen to cast a spell correctly and it's the right one for that moment in the game, then you can have success in moving on to the next challenge. The last example I'll show you is Hibot by Carolyn Hermans. The input to this is a leap motion sensor measuring information about where the joints of your hand are in space. Wekinator is used to determine whether you're waving or not. And if you are, it sends a message to a little motor attached to an Arduino, which is behind this little cardboard robot. There you go. Before I wrap up, I want to say a few words about how using interactive machine learning for mappings can impact on the design process, because it turns out that this approach offers a number of other benefits beyond just allowing people to work more effectively and accurately with sensor data. First, it turns out that using data and machine learning can be a lot better than math and code for communicating tacit knowledge and embodied practices to a computer. If you think about how you wave, for instance, if you were going to try to describe that to an alien who landed on Earth, you probably wouldn't describe that in words. You probably wouldn't describe that with a mathematical equation. Instead, you'd probably show some examples of waving, maybe in different styles. Turns out this is a great way to communicate to computers. It's much more natural and easy for us, and machine learning allows us to communicate this way rather than trying to change how we think about the things that we do as musicians, as dancers, as people moving and living in a space. Second, machine learning can allow creators to quickly prototype and explore many ideas. We know from research that this prototyping, exploration is key to any creative practice. And when I've studied people using Wekinator, one of the things that I've noticed is that they love to take advantage of this ability to make a thing really quickly, change that thing over and over by small changes to the training data. They can ultimately explore a much wider design space in a shorter amount of time than if they were trying to program and debug programming code. So in the end, this can allow people to end up with a system that's much more satisfying to them, that better meets their design goals. Third, designing with data enables more people to become creators. Anybody can provide examples given the right user interface. You don't need to be a programmer or a signal processing expert or even a machine learning expert to use this Wekinator-style interactive machine learning to build something that's really your own. For instance, in the sound control project you see on screen, my team built interactive machine learning tools for music teachers and therapists. These enabled them to build new musical instruments for kids with a really wide variety of disabilities, even though nobody here was a programmer or a sensor expert. And finally, machine learning can open up new creative relationships between humans and machines. For instance, Letitia Tsunami is an instrument builder who's used Wekinator for many years now. I once asked her to talk about why she likes using machine learning in her work, and she says that, in a way, you don't want the instrument to perform like a well-trained animal circus. You kind of want it to be a little wild, and you want to adapt to it somehow, like riding a bull. I think the machine learning allowed more of this fun of exploring, instead of going, I have to have a result right away, this thing is going to do that, and leaving it at that. And I think this is great. This speaks to a lot of the fun of exploring and the surprise that's accessible when you use machine learning, especially with regression, to give you totally new sounds that you didn't expect, or totally new computer behaviors that you didn't expect, right? You can give a few training examples that start to sketch out the kind of output space that you're interested in. But with certain types of machine learning models, especially regression, you have the capacity for that machine to give you something new that wasn't in the data. And of course, when you just build a mapping by programming, most of the time, if you're surprised, it's because there's a bug in your code and you have a compiler error or something doesn't work. But with machine learning, it can be really easy to be surprised with new sounds, with new behaviors that might actually inspire you. So that concludes my presentation. Thank you so much for listening.
Rebecca apologizes for joining us today. But yeah, thank you. It was a very interesting presentation. I think what we can do now is we can take 10 minutes to eat some of the snacks we have out there. Then we have 2 more presentations coming up, so don't leave. Okay. But let's maybe just take 10 minutes to take a quick break and then come back.
Yeah.
For questions, we're going to share them with her. So if you have questions, you can let us know. We'll send them to her and then she'll reply. She's the most responsive person on earth, so we'll get answers to all of the questions. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, so welcome back, everyone. Thank you for staying with us all afternoon. It's my absolute pleasure to yes, let's stand up. To introduce Professor Miu Ling Lam from City University of Hong Kong, from the School of Creative Media, an artist and professor who I greatly admire, and thank you so much for joining us today. Miu Ling is going to give us a presentation of her practice, and I think it'll be a fantastic addition to everything we've already heard this afternoon. So please.
So thank you, everyone. Thank you also to Peter and Roberto for the introduction as well as the invitation. It's my pleasure to share some of my practices and also my reflection onto the topic of multimodal mapping. Although actually most of the time when I work on my research and artistic project, I didn't actually think in this way. So it's actually a very good exercise to look back to your own practice and your own work from a different lens. So I give my talk a title, The Aesthetic of Hybrid Imagery, because many of my works involve visual production, that's why imagery. And I also found that in the context of multimodal mapping, it makes sense to not to just map data or transit information from one to another form, but also to integrate and allow the signal or information to transform together. So also the notion of hybridization here, I would say, and also when I pick, my projects, I consolidate 3 aspects of hybridization. It could be digital versus analog, no matter it is the type of information or the art form, art practice, and also deterministic versus stochastic, because like sampling and things like that to extract information, it could have different approach, and also material and physical, like virtual or reality, because in this, like often opposing but complementary ideas, when they come together, it usually brings a layer of complexity and not necessarily randomness or noise, but a lot of, in my experience, a lot of surprise and also poetic experience and expression and uniqueness too. So I'm going to share 3 of my projects. So when I say project, it is not just a project, but it might be a body of work under a methodology that I developed together sometimes with my PhD students and research associates. The first project that I call is computational light painting. So for those who are not familiar with the term light painting, it is the practice of, you can hold a point light source like your flashlight on your cell phone or even a candle, and you move in the space and allow a slow shutter camera to capture the movement of the light source. So then all the gesture and the position of the light source will be added together and collected by one single image. So in this particular picture, Picasso was invited to do an experiment conducted by a photographer, Jon McCormack, Ling, and in 3 particular moments, so the environment was darkened, but at 3 particular moments, the environment was, lightened so that we can see more clearly 3 different postures of the artist when he was drawing the figure. So everyone does that nowadays, and so when you think about what if we not just do it with a freehand stroke, but more in a controlled manner. And what if it is not just a point light source, for example, an array of light bulb or LED that can individually switch on and off, no, not that one yet, but yeah, another example was, of course, connecting the point light source to the end of the bow of violinist Heifetz, capturing his bow's trace while he was playing the violin. So what I meant by an array of light source, and when you carry the array of light source, and it does not only capture your movement because it sweeps a random surface, and when you do the long exposure, you can also create an imagery of more representational image. So in this case, and also academia, Canadian-based inventor Steve Mann, many years ago in 1974, he created this very interesting device to visualize some invisible signal, and in this case, it was radio frequency. So what then if I am not using, just an array of light, but a flat surface, for example, an iPad or my cell phone or even a projection as the light source, then I can actually sweep the flat display in the mid-air so as to create, a long exposure of three-dimensional pattern like this, okay? So basically, the idea is very much like 3D printing, right? You can first have a 3D model and then simulate the ping pattern, and then you slice the 3D model, and then you render the contour of the object at different time element that is tightly synchronized with the posture, the position, and the orientation of the display. Then you can obtain a, rather than abstract, but representational 3D pattern in the context of, light painting. Okay, so I call this practice as computational light painting, because if you can precisely acquire the relative pose of the light source, in this case the display, and the camera, because you can place it in arbitrary position, but once you calibrate them, you can get the 6 degrees of freedom pose, the relative pose of these two elements. And then in another configuration, if I am not to, put the camera still, but mount the camera onto onto the robot arm, having the display, or it can be a projection or other forms of display that I can change the content as the light source. So if we think about these two different, so this is called the computational kinetic photography. Kinetic photography is also a photographic practice where people may keep their shutter open, they may throw their camera in the mid-air, allow the movement of the camera to capture the environment, light traces in the picture. But in a computational approach, because I can again, get the relative position and orientation of the camera and the display, I can actually produce the same effect. So then, in reality, these two configurations are due to each other mathematically. So in one of the experiments that I did, I used the visual of the Visible Human project, where there were donors and their body, after they were dead, their corpses were sliced into thin slice and captured in high resolution image. So this video, if you drag it in space and capture long exposure, you will expect to obtain something rather than just the the silhouette, but also the internal data. So it's volumetric. And if you are not moving the light source, but moving the camera instead, so this is what I did in the lab. So you can see that because of the motion blur, your camera is moving, right? So the structure, everything is become blur because of the motion blur, but the content, the light pattern is representational. And also what I want to highlight here, of course, if I want to get a very clean and clear visualization of the volumetric data, I do not need to do that. But the interplay of, because I initially have the video, and then I do not just use the digital information to render, the 3D data, but allow the light and the movement of the robot and then the camera to play the role, making things more interesting because it is performative, and also the sampling, because you bring the light to the physical environment. And then, although I'm using a digital camera, but still it is a sampling process of the, of the photon. And then it was captured by the camera sensors. So there is a transition between digital and physical and virtual and reality. So I think this brings a layer of complexity, and as said here, there were occasions that I can put together this system as a installation setting. One of the occasions was like a few years ago. It was the 500th anniversary of Leonardo da Vinci's death, and there were an exhibition at CityU showcasing 12 original drawings of Leonardo da Vinci. It was a privilege of the city. So, and in many of Leonardo da Vinci's sketches, and some that were shown in Hong Kong, was his study of perspective, like geometric shape that were drawn with perspective, like this. So in that exhibition, when the curator invited us as media artists to develop words to respond to Leonardo da Vinci's practice, so I basically used the computational kinetic photography technique, set up a display, and then to capture in real time. So everything captured was live. The camera was controlled to, turn on the shutter, turn off the shutter, but for a very long period of time. Sometimes it takes 30 seconds, 1 minute, or more than 1 minute, so that all the pattern will be collapsed onto one single image, and then finally the outcome will be displayed on the other projection. So the attempt here is also to create perspective, like to study perspective, but in a very different approach than Leonardo da Vinci. Because, my approach was, of course, I first built the 3D model. Actually, my approach was much easier than Leonardo da Vinci, because once you have the accurate 3D model and you slice, and because the movement of the camera actually creates the geometric relationship between the instantaneous plane that I'm rendering as a contour as the camera, that would create the perspective. So these are the geometric shape that I have included in this installation that I call an impression machine. And in another occasion, I had the chance to consolidate another artistic concept to set up a performative robot installation using the computational kinetic photography technique. Was an exhibition called Art Machine, Past and Present. So it was a work that I worked in collaboration with Kaho Yu. This thing kind of blocked the text here. a friend of mine, also a former colleague of School of Creative Media. So the work is called disintegration, and I will explain why dis and integration. So it was done actually right at the middle of the social movement. So it is actually a reflection of our emotion and also perhaps the emotional landscape of Hong Kong people during the social movement. So we have picked 20 objects to be expressed and displayed using this system in this installation. So so this time we were not using a TV or secondary projection screen, but on the same projection wall, we both display the contour as well as the resultant image. And the previous, long exposure image would then retain here while we start to light paint the next object. So there will be, if you imagine the process, when the camera is moving and it starts building up one object because of the movement and also the display of the and also because the first object was retained there, and also because of the motion of the camera, then it brings about motion blur. So the previous object in the next photo will be blurry. That's why we call this artwork as disintegration, because it takes both, integration and also disintegration into one single setting. So some of the models that we include in this work were, like in the previous method, we just built the 3D model in software, and also this cone, although the texture was, obtained from a real roll cone. But many of other models that we use in the installation were actually real objects, and we tried to reconstruct the 3D model from a real object. So one of the objects was a kind of doctor's mask that I got many years ago when I was traveling in Venice. So what we did is to capture either many photographs from different perspectives or a video looking at different sides of the object. And then we use photogrammetry to reconstruct the 3D model. However, because especially for this case, if there's no texture, the whole object was white, the photogrammetry doesn't work. And then we had to do some intervention, like to project some additional pattern onto it while we were capturing different perspective of the object, so as to obtain a better quality 3D reconstruction. So this is the result while the camera was dragged by the robot in space. This is the projection screen, and so the process is actually that slow, but since they want to leave time for the audience to think about what's going on, think about how the photo will capture, how things comes together. A bit too slow. Okay, so the result is like that. So again, we can, of course, just to display the reconstructed 3D model without doing all this setup. But I think that through the process, it creates a sense of wonder because of the movement of the camera and the robot and the light being very abstract, and then after the whole process, it's like a game to guess what the model is at the end. And also, like what I said, the process brings in the stochastic complexity and surprise. So we'll quickly show you what the objects that we have captured, like the statue of the Lady of Justice. And also Lego that to mimic water barrier. And also because when you do photogrammetry, the reflection and the material will give you a lot of like artifacts. The previous case of the Dr. Mass, that in some case we just allow the artifacts be part of the work, like these holes and the imperfectism that incorporate in the final outcome. And also there are artifacts that were maybe not artifacts, but the property or the essence of the outcome, like these additional like patterns due to the slicing of the 3D object during the light painting process. And so this one illustrates that after the current object being captured, the previous object, I actually don't recognize what it is, but become blurry, so it like appeared. So this is one example that involves like many different forms of data, from a physical object, and then we do photogrammetry to obtain the digital model. And the digital model will be compute and simulate and being sliced and displayed in the physical world using the projector, and then the light is being captured by the digital camera, and it becomes, the analog information becomes digital again. So this is what I meant by the hybridization of imagery here. Another project that I want to illustrate this idea is a number of fog display that I have created in the past. So it was actually many years ago, there was a New Vision Art Festival in Hong Kong, and the curator actually invited me to send him a work, but he wanted that work to be a video work. So I'm not a video artist. So I was, and by that time I was very curious about what if I, project something into a immaterial screen, like fog screen, which is essentially a humidifier that will create water droplet that is small enough to suspend in the mid-air. And then because of scattering, and more precisely me scattering, that will then have the projection and the image being created in the air, and we can touch it. And more importantly, in this work, what I want to experiment is whether this kind of bistable optical illusion still be valid display this illusion in the fog. So it is a very famous optical illusion called the spinning dancer. It is called illusion because there is, the silhouette of a dancer spinning is displayed, but there is a lack of depth information, okay? So when the video frames put together, there are two possibilities. One is when the dancer is spinning in clockwise direction when we're looking from the top, or she could be also spinning in an anti-clockwise direction. So many people can draw what we perceive. Some cannot, like me. I always would perceive the dancer spinning in a clockwise direction. So what I submitted to the Vision Art Festival, but later on I further developed this work by adding some small intervention to it, which is a motion sensor. So my attempt was to allow the audience to control what they perceive, okay? So the audience can use their hand to touch the dancer to control whether she will spin in clockwise direction or anti-clockwise direction. So this is what I did. This is the original animation, right? Probably many of you can see dancers spinning in both directions, okay? It is because there's a lack of depth information. But if you add some very subtle line, okay, to confine individual moment, whether the leg is the left leg or right leg, the arm is left arm or right arm. Like in this case, the dancer is always moving in the anti-clockwise direction. And of course, if you do it, another way, you can control the dancer to be spinning in a clockwise direction. And also because the animation was projected in fog, you cannot actually tell, you cannot see the lines at all, because the fog projection is, the good thing or the bad thing is it becomes blurry and it hides the lines so that you can actually, do this trick to control the spinning direction of the dancer. So I think fog or mist is also a very good example illustrating, the interplay between digital and analog or or to bring in physicality to computational art. So this is not an art project, but more an engineering attempt to create a volumetric fog display using actually two approaches. One was to use, I can show the visual later. So this one involved a two-dimensional array of fog emitter that can individually switch on so that you can create a non-planar fog screen, and together with projection mapping, you can create content, visual content at different depth level. And of course, when you set up some depth camera or other kinds of sensor, it can do object recognition and also other interaction possibility. Like later on, we have an example of drawing in mid-air. And also, besides setting up the fog, nozzle in a two-dimensional array, we have another prototype that has only 4 fog emitter, but each of them are moved by a stepper motor, a linear motion platform. So again, you can create a non-planar fog screen. And also because it is just mist and it's cold, it's clean, so it actually creates a very interesting interactive possibility. So this is the other prototype that we have developed in the lab. So using fog projection, I have also produced some art pieces. So this one, also in collaboration with Kaho Yu, was a 2-channel animation where we set up not volumetric one, but 2 flat fog screen in a orthogonal, like 90-degree settings. So why we are doing that? Because we want to explore the narrative strategy of using fog. And in particular, because if you are very off angle, you cannot see the image very clearly because of the property of mere scattering. So that the audience had to stand in front or slightly off angle of one of the 2 fog screen in order to look at, the content. So everyone, because of different time and different position, they will put together different, sequence and different different version of the story. So although in some moment in the 2-channel animation were the same, there was a distortion of the video, but anyhow, yeah, but 2 different perspectives, but in some moment there were 2 different content, but they were connecting with each other, that some event would happen. So this was shown in video torch as I forgot the anniversary. It was 15th, 20th anniversary of Video Torch, a video art and media art organization in Hong Kong, and we did a workshop with many creative practitioners and hobbyists in Hong Kong at that time. the video scale is interesting because I cropped the video, so it you know, when it was displayed in another software, then this didn't work. Anyhow, another piece that I did also with the Fox screen, I invited a dancer, Fontaine, and I capture her movement in two perspectives. And again, I project her, you know, movement, the video in a L-shaped Fox screen. And in this time, what I did is not, you know, just to display the video, but incorporate some interactivity in it. So I have created a virtual, a digital fluid system so that the audience can use their hand or other, you know, body part to manipulate the visual. And also because the video was projected onto the Fox screen, and the Fox is a real physical fluid system. So there are actually two fluid systems. One is the virtual one, programmed, and other one is the physical fluid system of the Fox. And they will, you know, be seeing the interplay between the digital and physical fluid system that comes together. Finally, the third project that I've picked is actually a very old project, one of my earliest projects that I did in 2011. It was the Microwave Festival that I collaborate with a dancer, Frankie Ho, and also a musician, Connie Lin. So you imagine it was 13 years ago. So it was actually also an experiment to try to use different accessories of game console, like the Microsoft Kinect, and also the Wii balance board, and also the Wii remote control, which is like a joystick, but it is wireless that you can connect to the computer through Bluetooth. And I put the remote at the arms of Frankie, so as to capture her movement. So not exactly lots of comments on, you know, how I map, you know, the IMU data to the visual or the audio. The sound is also part of the performance. But what I want to talk about is the time element of it, okay? It is because, you know, gesture is, of course, dynamic and time-based. And like this clock, Frankie, she actually improvised. She didn't, you know, really do a lot of choreography, but she had to interact with herself that is 4 seconds ago, because I programmed in a way that if I go back to that particular moment right here, she was by herself, but you know, you see the visual, there were two dancers because one of the, you know, shadow was her history. So the time as a variable in this piece is very important. So in conclusion, so I finished all the three projects. So in conclusion, what I want to share in my experience of, you know, using different ways of collecting data or expressing visual or other forms or medium is mixing different types of signal will create a very interesting and sometimes fruitful outcome. Yeah. Thank you. So I guess I can take some questions. Do we have time for that?
We have time. Yeah, questions. Any questions? Yeah. Yes, sure. Also, let's give you the mic. Yes, sorry.
I was just wondering, with the robot arm, how fast can that move?
It can actually move quite fast, but yeah, we intend to do it more slowly.
Okay.
Yeah.
I was just wondering because you could do the light painting in real time,
Yes.
almost, if it was to be able to move around fast enough.
Yeah, actually you can do animation too if you want. Like if you sweep in really, really quickly and then you capture 1 frame, 2 frames, 3 frames, and then you put the frames together, you can create animation. But in those 2 words, we intend to make it like a performative piece. So that people can observe and think about the process.
Okay, yeah, that's it.
And I guess it depends on the condition, like how bright the environment is.
Yeah. Cool.
Okay. So just a quick question, like follow that project. You set up the robotic arms to capture something. So because I didn't understand, maybe like in the exhibition space, so there are performance, the trace of how it captures the things, or it
it is pre-programmed.
Being programmed, like they do before. And
so so there is a computer that connects to the robot, as well as the camera, and as well as the projector too. So the computer, has a program to, to sequence the different objects that will be, created. So if, for example, if I'm now creating the mask, then the robot, because it can report all the joint angle, it's a 6-axis robot arm. It reports all its 6 joint angle. Then the computer can calculate the end effector. That means the camera's posture, which is also a 6-degree of freedom information, because including the XYZ and the roll pitch yaw. Then this information would tell the computer right now at this particular moment what I should render and project it onto the wall. And in this case, it should be a contour, that is colored. And then when the camera is moving, then at the next moment, the contour shape and color will change. And then it's like what I said, is the process is very much like 3D printing. But we are now not printing with material or plastic,
contour of the object,
but with light. But layer by layer, it would stack up. And then the stacking up is actually in the camera sensor. Does it make sense to you?
maybe seeing the reality maybe can perceive.
Actually, I can demonstrate that to you. You know what? So imagine I'm the robot, because this morning I just downloaded the Stanford Bunny video to my cell phone, like this one. So if I'm doing this video, in mid-air, it was just the contour of a rabbit. But if I'm moving this in space, and if I have a camera that is shutter is slow enough to capture the entire process, then all the light information at different position will be collected by one single picture. Yeah, this is the what?
Okay, maybe I need more time to figure out, but maybe it's not.
And I have actually 3 research.
That is your homework now, to read the articles.
Yeah, but thanks for being interested in this.
I think we have time for one more question. I think. Yeah? Go for it.
I'm wondering, you using different light sources, sometimes it looks like a screen or a projection. I don't know if there was also a laser involved.
Not in that project, but yeah, it is possible. Yeah.
I'm wondering like what the difference is in like the materiality of the different light sources that you use, how that affects the end work. And then I guess just kind of a follow-up question have you like done any light painting where you will like maybe project the image on, like light on a wine glass, looks kind of weird, and then do some volumetric projection of those organic kinds of transformations?
Yeah, thanks for your question. Yeah, I have been thinking of, what kind of light source, how does it, put a layer of meaning to my words. So in the examples that I've shown, they were just digital display, like projector and TVs. But you can totally use other types of source, like there's a field called computational caustic. Caustics are the light pattern that we see, for example, when we're swimming in the swimming pool, the sunlight and the water, because of the refraction, it will create some abstract light pattern on the bed of the swimming pool, right? But if you think about, the refraction process, it actually can be controlled by, the shape of the refractive material. So there's actually a group of researchers who did computational caustic that will, for example, if you have a candlelight and if you have a material that can precisely control how the light will be refracted and project an image that is representational on the screen. That is actually very interesting.
Thank you.
Are there any more questions for Miu Ling? If not, I suggest we move on to our final speaker. Let's round of applause for Miu Ling. Thank you so much. Roberto, perhaps you'd like to introduce.
Do you want to?
No, if you'd like to.
Our final speaker today, who should be with us already online on the Zoom call, is Thor Magnusson, who is a professor at the University of Sussex and also Iceland University. Someone has been, leading in researcher in live coding, embedded AI, and then also like instrument development. He has a really cool lab in Iceland where they're doing really interesting research. So we would like to thank him for being here today. It's an honor and a pleasure to have you here, Thor. We can just, you can go for it. And then at the end, we'll have a few minutes for some Q&A from the audience. Thank you.
Great. Can you hear me?
We can, yeah.
Okay. So thank you for inviting me. It's a great lineup and very interesting talks, and it sounds like you are all having a great time there. I wish I could be with you. I would love to be in Hong Kong, but here I am in Iceland, and so I'm gonna talk a little bit about the lab and the research that we're doing. And I'm going to share my screen to show you some slides and some videos. And I'm going to share the sound as well. And now you should be able to see the slides, I think. Is it big screen now? The slides are filling up the screen? Yes, brilliant. Yeah, the title of the talk is Creative AI in Our Hands, Playing with Intelligent Instruments. And this is a project that we're running where we're focusing on creative AI, which of course is a field that is booming at the moment. It's been very active for some decades, of course, but as you all know, in the past year or two, with the advent of generative AI, particularly in the hands of users as consumer services, we are all playing with creative AI, whether it's ChatGPT and with text, or all these image and video and sound generating services, which are actually becoming quite impressive at the moment. They're not excellent, but I would say they are an engineering victory, a feat. You know, it's pretty impressive how far we've come in the past years there. But our project is slightly different. A lot of those services are on textual prompting. You talk, you put in a command, and you get a response in the form of an image or a sound or text. But in this project, we're kind of interested in the phenomenology of working with musical instruments, where the AI becomes a co-player or an agent or something that is part of our real-time, embodied, situated context. So it becomes part of our body, it becomes part of the physical instrument, not this call and response, talking with the system, but more kind of an extension of our body and mind. So it's a project that is funded by the ERC, European Research Council. So that makes it possible for us to focus on this for a 5-year period. And it's hosted at the University of Iceland. And what I want to talk about today is a little bit how we operate in terms of social engagement and citizen science. The way that obviously it doesn't make sense for us to sit 5 or 6 or 7 people in the ivory tower of a university research lab and speculate about how great AI instruments are for music making. We have to work with people. We have to talk with composers and performers. We develop instruments and we put them out into the field and collaborate with people. So this is, of course, great for public engagement and citizen science and all those things that are quite important in contemporary academic context. But we also think it is a very important research methodology for ourselves. It is through collaborating with people that we really understand our questions and our what we're doing. It's the feedback from people and experiences they have with these instruments that we are interested in. So I can show you just 2 very recent videos. We did a workshop on overtone flutes 2 weeks ago. And following that, we had a concert in Reykjavik where people who made these flutes, they performed with their instruments. And the instruments were typically augmented with digital technologies and some kind of systems that made the flute more than just a physical object, but systems that exhibited some kind of agency, and a conversation, a dialogue. And the first video is from that concert, and here we have a performer who designed this flute and the electronics for it. I'm gonna play it now. Okay, that's enough of this one. I want to also show you just a video from yesterday's Open Lab. Every Friday we open up our lab to people to explore some new work, and we are lucky to have a visiting researcher with us these days who's called Zeno van der Broek from Holland, and he's working with mechanical instruments and installations. And in this video, you can see how two percussionists, or in this case, people who were in the audience who came to the Open Lab, they were exploring the interaction between them playing and the machinic response. I think the video will explain. And in this case, we were exploring all kinds of interesting algorithms that represented the mapping between the human input and the way that the machine responded. A lot of the discussion was also about whether this was an instrument or whether it was a co-player, like someone external to the performance. And it was quite interesting that, you know, different algorithms, different mappings, different AI algorithms really changed the way that we perceived the solenoids hitting the wooden block. Whether it's, in some cases, it felt like an instrument, it felt like an extension of what you were doing, but then applying other algorithms, it became more of a distant co-player or an agency that was outside of yourself, something that kind of became an external thing that you had to respond to and play with in a way more similar to how you play with a human. So this is not a binary, you know, an instrument or an external agent. It's almost like it exists on a continuum, how the instrument at some point, it's very close to you, it's very much part of your body, it's part of your mind, and it kind of follows what you're thinking. But in other cases, it moves away from you and it becomes something that is external and you have to respond to in a different way. And it's so interesting to set these experiments up with people and have these conversations in an ad hoc kind of open way, because through these conversations we realize so many things it's so interesting just to have people playing with these instruments and these systems, because the more viewpoints you have, the more kind of comments from people with different backgrounds and different experiences, the better you see the object. So I really recommend kind of opening up your labs and when you're developing things to work with people and work with as many performers as you can. So I want to talk a little bit about the background of the project and also what we're thinking of in this work. So I've been very interested in musical instruments as tools for thinking and how musical instruments kind of define the music that we make. And this is, of course, something that has been the fact for all music at all times. And in a book that I will introduce in a moment, I explored kind of how 3 different types of instruments, acoustic instruments, electric instruments, and digital instruments, how they affect our thinking and embodied performance in very different ways. For example, in the acoustic instruments with violins or guitars or percussion, the instrument itself, the interface, is at the same time the sound production tool. So the vibration is coming from underneath your fingers often, and the energy that you put into the instrument is the energy that comes out of it. There's a very close mapping between gesture and sound, and you have an intimate relationship with the instrument. And fine control. It's mostly in these instruments you have a direct mapping, except maybe for harpsichord or pianos or organs, where there is a mechanism. That's a mapping. The hammer of the piano is a mechanism between you and the string. But mostly in these acoustic instruments, you are kind of interacting with the sound generator directly. It's under your finger, so to say. With electric instruments, you start to move away from this, and there's another energy source that comes into the picture, which is electricity and amplification and all kinds of electronics that can change the sound. But at the same time, it's still a direct kind of mapping from input to output. You have the electronics, you can do all kinds of things like filtering and so on, but there is a certain logic that is from the input to the output. But with digital instruments, all these mappings become very arbitrary, and you can basically design anything. You can map your instrument in any way and use algorithms to define the instrument. You can introduce scales or patterns of pitches or rhythms and so on in ways that you can't do with the other instruments. So digital instruments open up and offer an easier access. For example, we can make instruments for children or kind of amateur musicians or people who want to learn music, or disabled people and so on. We can kind of design instruments for more focused applications and uses. And this opens up a lot of interesting areas, I think. But I've been thinking about this for a long time, and a few years ago, a book that I wrote came out called Sonic Writing. And this is where I look into the technologies of material, symbolic, and signal inscriptions. I think musical instruments are inscriptions of musical ideas into material objects. So we're music theory comes out of the objects, but we also impose music theory into the objects. So, for example, the idea of having 12 notes in an octave in the piano, for example, this is an imposed theory that kind of is inscribed into the musical object. Symbolic inscriptions is much kind of younger practice where we, with the advent of writing and printing and so on, we've had for maybe, 4,000 years, if we really want to stretch it to some Hittite tablets, but maybe with, music theory and writing systems and notation systems, we're really just talking about 2,500 years where we've been in the practice of inscribing music through symbolic systems. And of course, as you know, the advent of musical notation, even if it exists in the past, in ancient times, it's really in the 10th century, 11th and 12th that this system develops. And with the Gutenberg press, you start to get music as a product, musical scores as a music product, as a file format, so to say, that could be commercialized and distributed. And with that, we also got the idea of the composer, the author, who started to attach their name to the compositions. In earlier times, it was mostly anonymous pieces of music. It was folk music, for example, and they didn't have authors. And you still have that in other musical cultures around the world. I mean, the Indian ragas don't have a composer that composed them. They just exist, and they've been in the tradition for centuries. And with signal inscriptions, we're talking about recording, phonography, to write the audio signal into some kind of material object. That's a wax cylinder or the wire or tape. But with the digital computer, we also get very sophisticated signal inscriptions where we can, of course, apply all kinds of analysis and music information retrieval techniques for machine listening and so on. So I think a lot of these technologies that we have in modern musical instruments, they exist in the past. We have had algorithmic music for millennia and for many centuries. There were, for example, Athanasius Kircher, the monk in the 17th century. He developed some musical robots and or musical machines, and also automated composition systems. And this is what we do in the computer today very easily. But a lot of that kind of maps to what we would call symbolic AI, where algorithms are defined and there is some kind of a machine that performs the algorithms. And of course, we don't need a machine to do that. We could do it by hand, but it just takes longer. But really, I mean, the last sentence of this slide is, and then the 21st century started. I think what I'm hinting at here is that in the past 10 years, and particularly in the past 2 years, we have the capability with great computer systems, server farms, and computer or programming architectures for machine learning, and also all the big data that exists all over the net. We're able to train neural networks on the data. So that is, like Rebecca said earlier, it represents a great shift. So you're not algorithmically defining what the computer can do or how it behaves, but you're rather teaching it how to respond to input. And this opens up for all kinds of possibilities. And in a way, it is a technology that you cannot find in the past, like a lot of the symbolic AI. It is a completely new paradigm shift in the way that we program computers through learning. You could maybe find that in gardening, the way people curate flowers, but also how they train animals and so on. I mean, there's a bit of teaching and giving awards and punishments and so on, and that is something we do in machine learning, of course. But it is really a new field that we're in. It's a completely new environment. And when you add this teaching into the musical instruments, if you have instruments that are adapting to you, performing with you, learning from you, and changing behavior, I think it's interesting to look at the dynamics between a performer and the instrument. And I call that in my book ergodynamics. It's the way that the functions of your body are translated into the functions of the instruments, but also what the instrument is in context, in time and space. What kind of aesthetics is there? What kind of history is there in the instrument? What kind of feeling do you get? And it's here that we find that phenomenology is very important. We need to study how we relate to the instrument, how we feel about them, and how we kind of engage with them, and what kind of musical ideas the instruments are imposing into for us. How does the instrument affect us? And we are finding that there is an interesting shift in music where people are becoming a lot of performers that we work with are becoming more interested in having the instrument speak or talk and offer up new dialogues. And many people have commented, for example, that the old idea of mastery of an instrument, of becoming a genius or some kind of virtuoso of your instrument, that people are becoming a bit tired of this, and they're wanting a bit more open dialogue with the instruments, a bit more exploration in the instruments, and to see the instrument as a system they can navigate rather than a dead object that they just perform on with their highly trained movements. Personally, I think this relates to how we, people who are younger than, I guess, 50 or something, grew up with computer games. We're used to interactive systems. We're used to navigating spaces, virtual spaces, and we're used to non-linear narratives and to use controllers to kind of explore. But it also relates to a certain philosophy that is happening quite strongly at the moment, which could be called post-humanism, where we are starting to realize more strongly, I guess, that the human species are not so unique, and that we are kind of messing around with the world and kind of posing a great danger to the earth itself, but also wanting to engage with nature and animals and artificial systems in a way where you're not focusing on the human ego, on the author, on the performer, but opening up for other influences. So it becomes more of a systematic or ecosystematic thinking, as opposed to one-directional interpretation of some kind of a score applied to a dead object, which is the musical instrument. This is a kind of a shift that is happening, and we are exploring that in 3 different research packages in our project, where we focus on the self. In the first work package, it's the phenomenology of musical instruments. In the second package, we focus on sociology, how it feels to work with non-human and human agents on the stage, in the musical performance. And in the third work package, we're looking at how this can be applied in epistemology, in knowledge, how knowledge changes with musical instruments. So how can we use instruments to study the world, to study musical scores, for example, or musical data, but also other kinds of data. And I like to kind of move back a little bit into history, to the 17th century, where we started to use instruments in science, to tools and instruments to understand the world and to explore the world through all kinds of devices. And I think what we're doing today is in many ways similar to that. We have created a lab that has a wall like this, and we design our instruments in a very ad hoc, quick prototyping methods, and we work with people to develop and change their instruments quickly in order to explore these ideas and answer the research questions we have. So lots of people come into our lab and work with us, play with us, and explore our ideas. The first instrument that we created was based on an Icelandic traditional instrument called the langspill, but we added agency to it through technology of feedback. So there's a resonator as part of this instrument, and the instrument behaves very unpredictably and interestingly, which gives the performer a bit of space to navigate and explore during a performance. It's difficult to play, for example, well, you can if you tune the instrument that way, but it's difficult to, when the instrument is in its essence, it's difficult to play with full control of the instrument. The idea of the instrument is to be a partner in the collaboration of musical playing, and we have found that people really love that. Yeah, so we have these open labs, and they are great. We get people to come, and they even take our instruments and develop their own instruments out of what we are making. So this instrument here on the right, we designed it as a Eurorack kind of module, so you can have the outputs of your synth modules feeding into the string instrument and resonating, so it becomes like a feedback physical resonator. And one of our collaborators really took that idea the full way and designed this kind of Eurorack module, where you can see that the instrument is really part of a Eurorack system. Yeah, we work with all kinds of materials, and this is seaweed, and we've been exploring seaweed in musical performance. We've also been exploring, like here on the right, e-textiles. We're interested in how the physics of the musical instrument changes and the perception of it as well when we use soft materials, kind of well-designed materials, beautiful materials, warm and flexible, as opposed to the typically hard materials of musical instruments. And in digital technologies, of course, as you know, we use plastic and rubber and glass screens and metal, which are, you know, materials of precision, but with e-textiles, we get materials that are quite open for this kind of exploration that we're interested in. And I'm gonna just play this video. It's Sophie Skach and Victor Shepardson. They have been performing on a no input mixer, but they use which is a feedback system, but they use the e-textiles as an interface for the system. Yeah, so I find it very interesting to put these systems out and have these open labs where people are collaborating like this, doing experiments, and then we talk a lot around these things. And by using e-textiles, for example, we opened up for a completely different type of research community, like people who work with textiles and are interested in textiles. And to have them collaborating with us was really inspiring. It opened up for so many interesting questions. So that's another way when we're doing music, there is no limit to music, really. Music is everywhere and everyone is interested in it. And it's possible to kind of apply the research we do in music in all kinds of fields. But what I've been saying is the shift that we are talking about is really, for me, and I argue for this in the book, it's a shift from composing a work like we did in the classical times, the idea of the big work and the big composer inspired by the muses, writing it down onto a notational score. I find that in today's music, and where the cutting edge of new music is happening, people are moving into inventing a system rather. So the work is replaced by a system, and the system is something that is open for exploration in real time on the stage. You could also say composing a system, but invention is a classical term for composition. Bach created inventions, for example, and it's a term from rhetorics. But it just happens that it also means the way we invent things today, often with technology, and so the invention of a system becomes really what I think a lot of composers and performers are doing. People are inventing audiovisual systems, instruments, installations, sound art, and so on. And it's always kind of a particular take. It's an original take. It's an original and idiosyncratic way of playing with technology and exploring the expressive potential of technology. I think we're a little bit late, and I don't want to take up too much time, but maybe I'll show a few more videos. I wanted to show this Basque instrument where you have two players playing. And in this case, we removed one of the human players. We trained the neural network on the human players, and the neural network is responding. So you can hear that here. This is a traditional Basque instrument, and it has a lot of interesting history. But for us, what we liked about it is that you cannot play it solo. You have to play together. two people at least, and we explored then to remove one of the humans and create a machine agent that would respond. This created so many interesting thoughts and experiences. For example, that we trained it on a lot of data, but the last training sessions we did for the neural network was with these two performers. And it was interesting how the system picked up the style of those performers and how they engage. So other Chalaparta players who tried the system, they really felt that they were playing with them. It was their ghost that was in the model. They were playing with the spirits of some real people in the style of those people. And this is, of course, something that we're exploring as well with neural audio synthesis, rave models, and when we train models on audio data. This is symbolic data here. I mean, it's events, but in the audio range, you really start to feel maybe who is the creator of the data set that was used to train the model. And this creates really interesting experiences for performers. And I think the next video I have is Nicola Privato here, who is busy training neural audio models, but he is also developing instruments or interfaces for them to explore them. And I'm going to play a little bit. So here he's playing particular model with these types of sounds, but he also pulls in other models like saxophones or choirs or violin models, and he's able to navigate the spaces of those sounds. What he is discovering is this sense of ownership of the data set and how he's engaging with the people whose data sets he's using. And for him, it's really like working with ghosts. You know, it's the ghost of the performer, and he's developing some theory about hauntography. That's like Derrida's hauntology with an H, not ontology, but hauntology, where he's exploring the ghosts of the past and the kind of liminal spaces between what is there and what is not there, and how history is haunting us. And for him, he's developing really interesting ideas of how to analyze and perceive the person and the qualities of the training in these neural audio models. So that's interesting. And these are one of his instruments. He does all kinds of workshops with them, notational scores for neural audio synthesis. And then I just want to show you the Haldorophone. We work with this instrument quite a lot. It's an instrument that has traditionally been one of the uniquely designed feedback instruments, string instruments, and people are using it widely these days. There are quite a few of these instruments around. Our technician, he develops them, Halldór Úlfarsson, and we have an Haldorophone that is specially made for our lab, the yellow one on the right. And here we have a computer as part of it, and we apply all kinds of algorithms in the feedback chain between the speaker and the strings. So at the back of the instrument, there is a speaker and it resonates the body of the instrument. So you get really interesting feedback. Here are some pictures. I can show you a video of that instrument in use. This is Julia Mogensen, who is a trained cellist, but when she started to work with this instrument, she really got interested in not playing much. She wanted to have the instrument playing, and she felt that the instrument had a certain personality that she didn't want to interrupt so much. And which we found funny because this is a cello instrument. It has the same interface as the cello, but she just wasn't interested in playing as she is normally used to playing. And it really shifted her mode into some kind of exploration and a dialogue with the instrument. And she's working with this instrument all the time. So we are kind of following how her relationship with the instrument changes over time. Because you cannot really, I don't think you can create an instrument and get some musicians into a lab setting and have them play it in 20 minutes and then ask some questions about the instrument. It's very difficult to run typical HCI studies or psychology studies on musical instruments. The terms are so vague. For example, what is music? What is expression? What is emotion? What is expressivity? What is the goal of music? I mean, these terms, it's very difficult to ask such questions, and you have to have a more longitudinal studies. You have to have a long dialogue and a long experience with the instrument to really get anything interesting out. Yeah, we've been working with Marco Donnarumma on prosthetics, on extending the body, and he has created some interesting performances. Marco was developing music for the hard of hearing or deaf people, and people could listen to the music through quite deep drones, but also through kind of transducers that he would give people. They're stuck on his body, like ears that you can see on his body there. Very beautiful performance. But as I said, I'm going to wrap up now. I think we're moving into an age in music, at least from the perspective I'm seeing it, where we're becoming a bit more interested in post-human intentionality, that we're interested in instruments that are open and conversational and are kind of systems that we have a dialogue with. And of course, in our research project, we are kind of exploring different definitions of agency and intelligence. And I think there is no clear definition here. It's interesting for us to apply the instruments on these questions and to explore the boundaries of our definitions through this type of work. But it's basically that we're kind of instruments are extensions of our body, have always been, you know, any instruments. But we are, as you know, becoming, we're gaining instruments of our mind in increasingly with the advent of generative AI and creative AI. And I think I'm just going to leave it here. I mean, I'm interested in how music is used as as a tool for research. I think we can do a lot of important research in the field of music, and that's something that Plato was also kind of looking at in the ancient Greek times, where he explores how the word music comes from the word investigation, to make philosophical inquiries. But I think I should stop sharing here and see if there are any comments or some questions or something. Thank you very much.
Should be able to. Yeah, can you hear us?
Yeah, yes. I can hear.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. That was super interesting. We might have some questions. I think this is a good way to finish the session today, because we kind of bring back into the equation. We're talking about mapping here, the idea that mapping is going to translate into some sort of materiality that we may want to define as an instrument that is an epistemic tool where we are kind of embedding theory. So the idea that whatever we do with those mappings will translate into something that is material, and people will have to engage with that. So that's part of the process as well of creating the mappings, and I think is really interesting. So I don't know if we have any questions from the audience or anyone that, yeah?
I had one to get us started.
There you go.
If that's okay. Thor, thanks so much for the talk. My world is more in the visual side of things, games and graphics and so on. And I was interested, for a brief moment, you mentioned generations who grow up with computer games and have a sense of interactivity as something that's considered normal. I'll try to make this question as efficient as possible, but it has a few little components. I heard someone describe AI as, for a generation who's used to a computer, giving a very precise answer based on, querying a database, to the equivalent of asking somebody on the street for directions. You might get a great answer, or you might get an approximate answer that could be kind of wrong. And it's that paradigm shift being quite dramatic. And as far as I know, the interfaces that typically we have in computers, even at their most advanced, which I would argue is a lot of the time with computer games, these very sensitive controls that in competitive games need a really fast response time, and plenty of examples of militaries using game controllers because they're very ergonomically designed. But in a way, their design is very different to a musical instrument in that it's still for a very, very precise signal, and the more precise, the better. Looking at what you've been doing with musical instruments and looking at the relationship between the encoding of music and the design of the instrument, thinking from the sort of 21st century paradigm of machine learning, computer interfaces, do you see anything in your work that sometimes makes you think, oh, this weird, floppy, nuanced, vibrational interface might, in any concrete or abstract way, shed light on how computer interfaces might also change to match this sort of more fluid and approximate sort of wisdom that's coming out through AI compared to, say, a Google search versus a ChatGPT search, or that sort of difference?
Wow, that's a really interesting question, and I think we could develop a dialogue and a conversation around it. I think it's also about goals and purpose and application. Obviously, if you're flying a military plane or passenger plane, for that sake, or indeed trying to achieve some difficult goals in a computer game, you don't really want those fluffy interfaces that we're talking about here. You need precision. So. And that precision has been the goal in HCI as well. It's been what we're trying to do, to have ergonomically efficient interfaces to complete a task with the best way possible. The less steps, the best kind of direct gesture to result is seen as the goal. But then what is maybe emerging, and it's maybe just another flower in the garden and not the same flower, is a perception that the machine doesn't, or our interaction with the machine doesn't have to be a precise tool or a kind of an extension of our body or control interface to achieve a task, but more of a conversation partner, like you say. And a bit like, the person in the street, you ask something and you get a response, and sometimes it's good, sometimes not. Why wouldn't we have those kind of systems in the computer? And indeed, we do have that now. I mean, ChatGPT can answer your questions in many ways, and sometimes it's better and sometimes it's not so good. So I think and the new generative AI is perhaps helping us also to become aware of this possibility that the computer is not a precision tool, but a generative tool, like our garden. We plant a few seeds and something grows. And a good example is just then the difference between Photoshop and Midjourney. Photoshop is a precision tool where you have interfaces and Wacom tablets and what have you, erasers you have all kinds of tools to make really precise images. But then you have Midjourney where you're not in control, but you might like the results and you're happy with it, and you have ways of maybe changing it a little bit, but you never have that full control. So I think your question is really, really interesting, and I don't think there are any definite answers, except my comment is really that we're just gaining a new type of tool, which is not about that precision, but about exploration and conversation. I mean, when we talk together as humans in the pub or in the cafe or something, we are not engaging with precision. You never know what the other person is answering. You don't even know what they mean by the words they use. That takes a while for someone to understand or learn or get to know someone so that you know how they use the language they use. So it's very interesting. Thanks for the great question, and I think it's something that I will think about more.
Okay, and thanks for the talk. Are there any other questions from the audience? Any questions for Thor Magnusson?
No, well, we might have some more. If we do, I might send you an email with a few. Thank you, Thor, for being here today. It's really a pleasure to have you here. Hopefully next time we'll meet. We'll be in the same room, in the same place.
Yeah,
we're also happy. We're also happy to come to Iceland. That's perfectly fine. We like it there. So you can come here. We can go there. Thank you.
I'd be happy to come to Hong Kong. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Yes.
It's great to be with you today.
And
see you later.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye. Thank you.